My daughter married a young millionaire, and everyone said they were the perfect couple. While we were dancing at their lavish reception, she discreetly slipped a crumpled piece of paper into my pocket. Inside, I found a note saying, "Dad, help me." I froze. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your family from a monster wearing a perfect smile. My name is Richard Stanton. I am 70 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years calculating load-bearing walls, stress fractures, and the invisible breaking points of massive concrete buildings. You learn a lot about how things fall apart when your entire career is dedicated to keeping them standing. You learn that the most dangerous cracks are never the ones you can see on the surface. They are the microscopic fissures deep within the foundation, quietly expanding under pressure until the whole structure collapses without warning. I had spent my life preventing those collapses, yet I failed to see the one happening right in front of me. Tonight, I was supposed to be celebrating. I was standing in the center of the grand ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton, holding my 28-year-old daughter Harper, as we swayed to the soft rhythm of a jazz quartet. It was the traditional father and daughter dance. The room around us was a spectacle of wealth and privilege. Vaulted ceilings with crystal chandeliers, tables draped in imported silk linens, and massive floral arrangements that probably cost more than my first house. Her new husband, a 32-year-old billionaire tech mogul named Harrison Thorne, had spared no expense. $200,000 dropped on a single evening just to show the world how perfect his life was. But as I held my daughter looking at the sea of applauding guests, I felt an overwhelming chill. The entire event felt structurally cold. It lacked the warmth, the genuine joy that should have filled a room on a wedding day. I found myself missing my late wife Evelyn more than ever. Evelyn passed away 5 years ago from a sudden heart failure. If she had been here, she would have warmed this icy room with her laughter. She would have known exactly what to say to make Harper smile a real smile. Instead, it was just me, an old man in a stiff tuxedo, trying to pretend this was the happiest day of my little girl's life. I pulled Harper a little closer, trying to feel that familiar bond we had always shared. But something was wrong. Very wrong. When I placed my hand against her back, I noticed how rigid she was. She was not swaying to the music. She was moving mechanically, like a building bracing for an earthquake. I looked down at her hand resting on my shoulder. Her fingers were trembling. Not just a slight nervous flutter, but a violent, uncontrollable shake. Her skin was ice cold, completely drained of warmth, despite the heat of the crowded ballroom. "Harper, sweetheart," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady so the surrounding guests would not notice. "Are you feeling all right? You are shaking like a leaf." She did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, pressing her body tightly against mine. She buried her face deep into my shoulder, hiding her expressions from the hundreds of cameras and cell phones pointed in our direction. To the crowd, it must have looked like an emotional, tender moment between a father and his daughter. But I knew the difference between a hug of affection and a desperate cling for survival. "Dad," she breathed into my ear, her voice barely a fraction of a whisper. Her breath was ragged, catching in her throat. "Just keep smiling. Please do not look at him. Keep dancing." My engineering instincts, honed over decades of anticipating disasters, flared instantly. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, echoing the heavy bass of the jazz band. I forced a gentle smile for the cameras, nodding, as if she had just whispered a sweet childhood memory. "What is it, Harper?" I asked softly, keeping my jaw relaxed. "What is wrong?" In that split second, under the cover of my broad shoulder and the flowing fabric of her extravagant wedding gown, Harper moved her hand. She slid her fingers down my chest and forcefully shoved a small, tightly crumpled piece of paper deep into the breast pocket of my tuxedo. Her hand lingered there for a fraction of a second, her fingers gripping the edge of the pocket as if she was afraid of falling off a cliff. I did not react. I did not pull away. I kept my hand on her back, guiding her through the slow, sweeping motions of the waltz. The music seemed to stretch every note, pulling tighter and tighter, like a tension cable about to snap. I could feel the sharp edges of the crumpled paper through the silk lining of my jacket. It felt heavier than a block of lead. As the song approached its final crescendo, I gently pulled back to look at her face. I needed to read her eyes. I needed to see what was hiding beneath the flawless makeup and the expensive veil. When she lifted her head, the look she gave me paralyzed every muscle in my body. Her eyes, the bright, joyful eyes of the girl I had raised, were wide with absolute primal terror. It was a look of pure, unadulterated fear. The kind of look you see in a trapped animal realizing the predator has locked the cage. There was no joy. There was no future. There was only a silent, desperate scream echoing behind her pupils. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand to know what was happening, to stop this entire charade right then and there. I wanted to grab her hand, pull her out of that ballroom, and drive far away from this madness. I did not care about the money, the guests, or the embarrassment. I just wanted my daughter safe. But before I could even form the first syllable, a shadow fell over us. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Harrison had stepped onto the dance floor. He was standing right beside us, immaculate in his custom-tailored suit, his posture perfect, his smile dazzling and utterly hollow. He placed a heavy structural hand on Harper's bare shoulder. I watched her entire body flinch at his touch, her spine stiffening instantly. "May I cut in, Richard?" Harrison asked, his voice smooth and commanding. "The music is fading, and I simply cannot wait another second to hold my beautiful wife." I looked at the crumpled note hidden in my pocket, then back to my daughter's terrified eyes. The foundation of our family was cracking, and I was the only one who could see it. I took a deep breath, preparing to face the monster hiding in plain sight. The battle for her survival had just begun, and I wouldn't lose. Before I could process her terror, Harrison smoothly stepped between us. His entrance was seamless, calculated with the exact precision of a mechanical metronome. He did not ask to cut in. He simply assumed his position as if the space belonged to him by divine right. His camera-ready smile flashed toward the wedding photographer, hovering nearby, a blinding display of perfect white teeth that never quite reached his eyes. As he pulled Harper away from me, I watched the physical mechanics of his movement. To the untrained eye, it was a passionate embrace, the eager groom claiming his beautiful bride. But my entire career was built on observing unseen stress points. His hand did not rest gently on her waist. It clamped down like a forged steel vise. It was a structurally rigid grip designed exclusively to restrict movement, not to guide a willing dance partner. I felt the sudden chilling void where my daughter had just been. She did not look back at me. Her posture was locked, her head bowed just enough to hide her face from the flashing lights of the cameras. I stepped off the dance floor, the loud applause of the surrounding crowd washing over me like meaningless static noise. My heart was hammering heavily against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the jazz band playing their final triumphant chords. I needed a moment away from the suffocating perfection of this expensive ballroom. I needed to see exactly what she had slipped into my pocket. I navigated quickly through the dense sea of wealthy guests, ignoring their polite nods and the constant clinking of champagne glasses. I moved swiftly toward the grand hallway, pushing through the heavy mahogany doors of the men's restroom. The sudden quiet of the marble-lined room was deeply jarring. I walked straight to the farthest sink, locked my hands firmly onto the cold edge of the counter, and stared at my aging reflection for a brief second. My breathing was shallow and uneven. My hands, usually steady enough to draft complex structural blueprints down to the exact millimeter, were trembling slightly as I reached into my dark tuxedo pocket. I pulled out the crumpled piece of paper. It was a torn scrap, clearly ripped in a massive hurry, perhaps from a dinner menu or a reserved seating chart. I slowly smoothed out the harsh creases against the smooth marble countertop. The black ink was smeared, written with a frantic, unsteady hand that I immediately recognized. It was not the neat, elegant script Harper had used on all the wedding invitations. It was the desperate scrawl of a terrified, cornered child. 3 simple words. Dad, help me. I read those 3 words over and over again, tracing the jagged lines of the ink with my eyes. The world around me seemed to tilt violently, the structural integrity of my reality fracturing completely under the massive weight of that simple sentence. This was absolutely not a joke. This was not normal pre-wedding anxiety. This was a clear distress signal. My only daughter was currently trapped inside a $12 million event, completely surrounded by hundreds of oblivious witnesses, and she was silently begging for her life. I folded the note carefully, slipping it back into my pocket, feeling its remarkably heavy presence against my chest. I left the restroom with a cold, singular focus. I desperately needed to find her. I needed to get her completely alone, away from the roaming cameras, away from the watchful eyes of high society, and away from him. I aggressively scanned the massive ballroom, pushing past a loud group of tech investors, laughing boisterously near the open bar. They were not on the dance floor anymore. I suddenly spotted a quick flash of white silk disappearing down a dimly lit exit corridor leading toward the private bridal suites. I quickened my pace, my formal leather shoes sinking deeply into the thick carpet as I followed them. I turned the corner and intercepted them just as Harrison was casually swiping an electronic keycard to enter one of the secluded private rooms. Harper was leaning heavily against the wall, her head resting on the expensive, textured wallpaper, looking completely drained of life. "Harrison," I called out, keeping my tone extremely measured but firm. "I need a private moment alone with my daughter." Harrison turned very slowly. The charming, camera-ready smile was back on his face instantly, perfectly constructed, and completely devoid of genuine warmth. "Richard," he said, his voice dripping with practiced affection. "Of course. But perhaps we can do this a little later. It has been an incredibly long day, and our beautiful bride is just a little overwhelmed right now." I stepped closer, purposefully closing the physical distance between us. "I am not asking for a long conversation, Harrison. I just want to speak with Harper, privately." Before I could even finish my sentence, Harrison smoothly sidestepped, positioning his body directly between Harper and me. It was a subtle, highly protective maneuver, but the underlying message was extremely clear. I was merely a guest, and he was the absolute gatekeeper. "Richard, please understand," he said, lowering his voice to a tone of sympathetic concern. "You know exactly how she gets with large crowds. She is currently having one of her little panic attacks, just like she used to have back in college. You remember those, do you not?" He spoke to me as if I were a clueless old man who had completely forgotten my own daughter's medical history. But Harper had never had a panic attack in college. She was the formidable captain of the debate team, a strong woman who thrived under extreme pressure, who could stand confidently in front of an auditorium of 500 people and deliver a flawless, commanding speech. He was feeding me a perfectly constructed, plausible lie, a totally fabricated history intentionally designed to excuse whatever terrible thing was happening right now. Without breaking eye contact with me, Harrison reached into his perfectly tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small amber prescription bottle. He rattled it gently. "I have her medication right here. A quick, mild sedative to efficiently calm her nerves, and she will be right back out there smiling beautifully for the cameras. She just needs a quick moment to catch her breath. I am taking very good care of her, Richard. You really do not need to worry." I looked directly past his broad shoulder, focusing my intense gaze entirely on Harper. She was standing perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her extravagant dress. "Harper," I said softly, completely ignoring his fabricated narrative. "Look at me. Sweetheart, do you want to go home right now? We can leave immediately. You do not have to do any of this." The silence in the narrow corridor was absolutely suffocating. I waited patiently for her to run to me. Instead, she slowly lifted her head. "I am just overwhelmed, Dad," she whispered. Her voice lacked resonance. It was flat, completely devoid of emotion. "I am completely fine. Really. Just give us a minute." Her words entirely belonged to him. I forced my posture to relax entirely, letting my shoulders drop to effectively mimic the profound relief of a concerned but ultimately reassured father. 40 demanding years of surviving the unforgiving, cutthroat world of commercial construction had taught me exactly how to play the delicate game of optics. If Harrison Thorne urgently needed to believe he had successfully managed this little situation, I would let him believe it with total conviction. I nodded slowly, deliberately, softening my gaze to mask the intense, burning adrenaline surging through my veins. I took a deliberate step backward, offering him the physical space he had so aggressively claimed around my daughter. "You are absolutely right, Harrison," I said, making sure my voice carried nothing but warm, paternal surrender. "The crowd out there in the main ballroom is truly deafening tonight. I should not have hovered over her like that. I just wanted to make sure my little girl was completely all right before the big grand send-off." Harrison smiled. The rigid tension in his sharp jawline vanished instantly, replaced by the smooth, polished satisfaction of a man entirely used to getting his way in every conceivable scenario. He slipped the amber prescription bottle back into the inner pocket of his custom-tailored suit jacket with a practiced, fluid motion. "I deeply appreciate you understanding, Richard," he replied, his tone once again dripping with that sickening, manufactured charm that had easily fooled everyone else. "We will have her resting comfortably in the back of the car in no time at all. Just a little quiet time will fix everything right up." I turned my undivided attention back to Harper. She had not moved a single inch since Harrison had intercepted us. She stood completely frozen against the expensive hallway wallpaper, staring blankly at the intricate floral patterns woven into the carpet beneath her feet. I reached out, stepping back into her personal space just enough to wrap my arms around her trembling frame for a final, seemingly ordinary goodbye. As I pulled her into a protective embrace, I deliberately slid my right hand down her left arm, letting my thumb rest firmly against her wrist, pressing gently beneath the heavy lace sleeve of her extravagant gown. What I felt in that brief, fleeting fraction of a second completely stopped the blood flowing in my veins. My mind, rigorously trained for decades to instantly detect hidden structural flaws and catastrophic material fatigue, automatically analyzed the tactile information my thumb was receiving. There is a very specific, undeniable way physical materials yield under extreme punishing pressure. Solid concrete cracks and splinters. Structural steel bends and groans. Human tissue swells and burns. Beneath the incredibly thick, heavily powdered layer of high-end cosmetic concealer that Harper had applied, the skin on her delicate wrist was raised rigid and unnaturally hot to the touch. I could physically feel the distinct deep indentations of individual fingers permanently etched into her bruised flesh. It was a severe grip bruise, the undeniable physical aftermath of immense violent restricting force. Someone had grabbed her wrist with the direct, malicious intention of inflicting serious pain, of dragging her forcefully against her own desperate will. I kept my breathing perfectly steady, refusing to let my absolute horror register on my face. I kissed her gently on the cheek, whispering a soft, generic goodbye into her ear for Harrison to hear. I did not dare say a single word about the crumpled note currently burning a hole in my pocket. I did not squeeze her hand in solidarity. I knew Harrison was standing just inches away, closely watching every single micro-expression on my aging face. I stepped back smoothly, smiling warmly at the newly married couple, as if I did not have a single care in the entire world. "We really should get you two on your way," I said cheerfully, gesturing toward the grand exit at the end of the long hallway. "Your driver is waiting at the front portico, and the guests are getting restless for the sparkler exit." Harrison nodded approvingly, his heavy hand immediately returning to Harper's lower back, guiding her forward with that same unyielding mechanical pressure. I followed a few polite paces behind them as we slowly made our way through the spectacular main lobby of the hotel and out into the warm, humid summer night air. A massive crowd of well-dressed wedding guests had already gathered outside, cheering loudly and enthusiastically, waving long, brightly glowing sparklers in the air. The valet had pulled the extravagant getaway vehicle right up to the curb. It was a massive custom-built armored Maybach featuring extremely thick, ballistic glass and a heavily reinforced steel chassis. It looked significantly less like a luxury wedding car and much more like a mobile military fortress designed to repel an active siege. Harrison smiled broadly and waved to the cheering crowd, absolutely basking in the superficial adoration and the rapid flashing lights of the hired professional photographers. He opened the heavy armor-plated rear door for Harper, masterfully playing the role of the perfect, attentive gentleman. She climbed inside awkwardly, her movements still heavily restricted, completely devoid of the natural, confident grace she had naturally possessed her entire life. Harrison followed her in smoothly, pausing for one final highly triumphant wave to the captive audience before finally sliding into the dark, luxurious interior. I stood silently on the edge of the velvet red carpet, completely ignoring the chaotic, joyous celebration happening all around me. My eyes were locked exclusively on the rear passenger window as the exceptionally heavy armored door slammed shut with a solid, echoing thud that resonated deeply in my chest. The thick, heavily tinted glass began to roll up very slowly, mechanically, sealing them off from the outside world. In that brief, rapidly fading sliver of ambient light penetrating the vehicle, I saw the exact terrifying moment the elaborate performance permanently ended. The charismatic, loving groom simply vanished into thin air. The dazzling million-dollar smile dropped from Harrison's handsome face with terrifying, unnatural speed, leaving behind a cold, rigidly expressionless mask of pure malice. His eyes, completely stripped of their fabricated warmth and charm, turned dead calculating and wildly predatory. He did not look like a passionate man admiring his beautiful new wife. He looked exactly like a ruthless warden glaring at a disobedient prisoner who had just attempted a futile escape. As the tinted window closed the final few crucial inches, I watched in absolute paralyzed horror as his arm shot forward with blistering speed. He grabbed Harper violently by the shoulder and aggressively yanked her backward, pulling her forcefully into the pitch-black shadows of the deep back seat. She did not even have the necessary time to raise her trembling hands to defend herself before she disappeared completely into the darkness. The sleek, massive vehicle pulled away from the illuminated curb smoothly, its powerful, finely tuned engine humming quietly as it merged effortlessly into the busy evening traffic. The wealthy guests standing around me continued to cheer wildly, completely oblivious to the horrific nightmare that had just driven away right in front of their eyes. They tossed the remaining burnt-out sparklers into polished brass water buckets, laughing loudly and chatting enthusiastically about the beautiful ceremony, the incredibly expensive food, and what a truly perfect, deeply in love couple Harper and Harrison were. I stood there frozen on the concrete pavement, feeling completely alone in a vast sea of oblivious, happy people. The hot, humid summer breeze suddenly felt like freezing ice against my aging skin. My right hand remained buried deep within my tuxedo pocket, my fingers tightly gripping the crumpled, frantic note my daughter had risked absolutely everything to secretly give me. This was decidedly not a simple case of wedding day jitters. This was not a young, exhausted bride feeling slightly overwhelmed by a large, demanding crowd. This was a terrifying hostage situation, perfectly wrapped in a multi-million-dollar, highly publicized fairy tale. My daughter had just been taken away by a calculated, extremely dangerous monster. My first instinct, the primal roaring urge of a desperate father, was to sprint directly to my own car, violently chase down the Maybach, and forcefully drag her out of that heavily armored vehicle with my own bare hands, regardless of the severe consequences. My second instinct was to immediately call the police to dial emergency services and demand they set up a roadblock to stop the Maybach and completely rescue my little girl from whatever fresh hell awaited her. But 40 long years of complex structural engineering had fundamentally hardwired my brain to completely suppress impulsive emotional reactions. I knew from hard experience that rushing blindly into an active disaster zone only guaranteed additional catastrophic casualties. I forced my racing heart to slow down, forcing myself to deeply analyze the terrifying situation, logically, meticulously, calculating the massive load-bearing walls of the seemingly insurmountable problem I was facing. For 3 agonizing weeks, a wall of absolute silence stood between me and my daughter. Every single day I picked up my phone and dialed her personal number, expecting to hear her vibrant voice on the other end of the line. Instead, I was greeted by the artificially flawless, synthesized tone of Harrison Thorne, proprietary digital AI assistant. The programmed voice would inform me that Mrs. Thorne was currently unavailable to speak, resting comfortably or occupied with social engagements. Sometimes late at night, when the silence became unbearable, I would receive a brief text message from her number. They were always short, structurally perfect sentences, completely devoid of her usual warmth and unique personality. "I am doing perfectly fine, Dad. Very busy setting up the massive new house. Love you." They were words typed by a machine algorithm, not by a frightened woman who had just slipped a frantic cry for help into my pocket. I knew the distinct cadence of my daughter communication style. Those clinical generic texts were poorly constructed, digital facades designed to keep me at a comfortable distance. The agonizing daily waiting eroded my patience, eating away at my rational restraint, like persistent cold water seeping into a poorly sealed concrete joint. By the early morning of the long 21st day, I could no longer tolerate the manufactured, deeply suspicious isolation. I finally grabbed my heavy car keys, got into my vehicle, and drove purposefully out of the city center, heading straight toward the affluent, heavily wooded hills of the wealthy northern suburbs. The winding scenic roads grew significantly narrower and far more secluded the higher I climbed, completely surrounded by towering, ancient oak trees and thick, dense foliage that effectively hid the immense, staggering wealth nestled quietly within the rugged landscape. Harrison had recently purchased a sprawling $12 million ultra-modern architectural estate located at the absolute peak of the isolated ridge. He had proudly spent several $1,000,000 more extensively retrofitting the massive property with his own company, cutting-edge smart home technology, effectively transforming a residential home into a self-sustaining, highly automated, deeply intimidating digital fortress. But as I navigated the final incredibly steep curve leading up to the massive imposing property line, my trained mind was not focused on the superficial high-tech upgrades that Harrison loved to brag about in magazines. I was actively looking past the sleek hidden security cameras and the polished titanium architectural finishes. I was deeply analyzing the bare fundamental bones of the earth, buried beneath the luxurious estate. 15 years ago, long before Harrison Thorne had even made his very first $1 million, my former commercial structural engineering firm had been aggressively contracted to pour the primary foundational retaining walls for this exact, highly difficult, uneven plot of land. The ambitious developer had massive, sweeping dreams, but the soil composition was notoriously unstable, highly prone to sudden, dangerous, and catastrophic landslides during periods of heavy seasonal rainfall. I had personally supervised the intricate, highly demanding installation of 30 deep steel structural pilings, meticulously calculating the precise load-bearing distribution strictly required to anchor a massive, heavy structure safely and securely to the side of the unforgiving hill. I knew the deeply buried, unseen skeleton of this magnificent estate far better than the arrogant young billionaire who currently owned the deed. I knew exactly where the deep structural anchors were buried. I knew the specific exact thickness of the heavily reinforced concrete slabs hiding silently beneath the manicured emerald green lawns. And most importantly, I knew the specific locations of the hidden utility access points that were completely invisible on the modern blueprints. I finally arrived at the main gated entrance, pulling my car to a complete halt directly in front of a pair of towering solid steel security gates that looked like they belonged to a highly secure military compound rather than a private residential home. I rolled down my driver's side window and pressed my finger firmly against the call button on the sleek flush-mounted electronic intercom panel. A glowing bright blue light scanned my facial features instantly, and a soft, pleasant electronic chime loudly indicated a successful biometric facial recognition scan. However, the heavy, imposing steel gates remained firmly shut. Instead of a human security guard asking for my name, the exact same artificially flawless voice I had been dealing with on the phone for 3 long weeks echoed clearly and loudly through the outdoor speaker system. "Good morning, Mr. Stanton. The digital system has successfully verified your identity. Unfortunately, Mr. and Mrs. Thorne are not currently receiving unannounced visitors at this specific time. Please schedule an official appointment through the primary corporate office line. Have a very pleasant day." The intercom clicked off sharply with a cold, highly dismissive electronic sound. I stared intensely at the solid steel barrier gripping my leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. They were completely, systematically locking me out of my daughter life. My own child was trapped somewhere deep behind those massive, physically imposing walls, and her new husband had effectively built a highly sophisticated digital moat to keep me permanently exiled and entirely helpless. I angrily shifted my car into reverse gear, slowly preparing to pull over to the dirt shoulder to quickly reconsider my immediate tactical approach. I refused to leave the property, but I understood with total clarity that blindly ramming a pair of heavily reinforced steel gates with a standard 4-door sedan was an exercise in absolute destructive futility. Just as I began to back away slowly, a large, heavy-duty commercial delivery truck came rumbling loudly up the steep, winding private access road. It prominently bore the bright green logo of an exclusive, highly expensive organic grocery delivery service, likely carrying the weekly culinary provisions for the sprawling, heavily staffed estate. I quickly and quietly pulled my car tight against the rocky shoulder, effectively hiding my vehicle completely in the deep, obscuring shadow cast by a large, overhanging ancient oak tree. I watched closely as the uniformed delivery driver pulled up directly to the sleek intercom system. He did not press the silver call button. Instead, he smoothly held up a specialized, pre-programmed digital keycard to the optical scanner. A bright, solid green light flashed immediately, and the massive, heavy steel gates began to glide open, slowly sliding back seamlessly on perfectly oiled tracks. This was an incredibly risky, highly impulsive maneuver, exactly the kind of deeply flawed structural miscalculation that usually resulted in a devastating, catastrophic collapse. But the burning, haunting memory of Harper wide, terrified eyes staring deeply into mine on the crowded dance floor forcefully pushed all logical caution and basic common sense completely aside. I swiftly shifted my car back into drive. I waited patiently, watching carefully until the heavy commercial delivery truck began to roll forward, accelerating slowly and steadily through the widening opening. The massive security gates were intricately programmed to close automatically the exact precise second the large delivery vehicle cleared the internal laser sensor perimeter. I slammed my foot heavily and aggressively onto the gas pedal. My engine roared loudly as I accelerated sharply out of the dark hiding shadows, recklessly tailgating the delivery truck with less than 3 feet of clearance between my front bumper and his heavy rear loading ramp. The spatial timing had to be absolutely, perfectly flawless. If I miscalculated the distance by even a single microscopic fraction of a second, the rapidly closing steel gates would ruthlessly crush the side of my car like a fragile aluminum can. I held my breath, gripping the wheel firmly as we crossed the secured threshold together. I heard the deep, grinding mechanical hum of the gate motors immediately kicking back into high gear the very moment the large truck passed the invisible sensor line. The heavy steel panels began to slide shut rapidly. The rear bumper of my vehicle barely scraped past the thick, unyielding metal edges, safely crossing onto the private, highly secured grounds mere milliseconds before the massive gates slammed together tightly behind me with a loud, incredibly heavy, echoing boom. I hit the brakes, exhaling a sharp, ragged breath of profound relief. I was finally safely inside the highly fortified perimeter. But that sense of victory was instantly shattered into pieces. Almost immediately after the heavy gates closed, I noticed a subtle, deeply unsettling, and calculated change in the immediate physical environment around me. The bright, welcoming ambient lighting positioned along the long, winding, perfectly paved driveway suddenly shifted drastically from a soft, warm white to a dull, aggressive, and pulsing amber color. Small, previously hidden security nodes embedded directly into the manicured, expensive landscaping began to emit a faint, incredibly high-pitched electronic hum that vibrated in my ears. I had successfully bypassed the massive physical barrier using analog methods, but in doing so I had just tripped a sophisticated network of silent, automated digital alarms. The pulsing amber lights guided my car along the winding driveway, casting long, menacing shadows against the pristine landscaping. I knew my arrival had been broadcasted to every screen and device inside the sprawling estate. The element of surprise was completely gone, replaced by the cold reality that I was driving straight into the belly of the beast. The heavy tires of my sedan crunched over the crushed gravel of the circular motor court, bringing me to a halt directly in front of the massive, custom-built oak double doors of the main entrance. Before I could even shift the car into park and turn off the ignition, the front door swung open seamlessly. Harrison stood framed in the massive doorway, dressed in immaculate casual wear, looking like a curated advertisement for a billionaire lifestyle magazine. His hands were tucked casually into his pockets, and that same flawless camera-ready smile I had seen at the wedding was plastered securely across his handsome face. He walked down the wide stone steps to greet me, extending a firm, confident hand as I stepped out of my vehicle. "Richard." "What an entirely unexpected surprise," Harrison said, his voice smooth and practically vibrating with artificial warmth. "We were not anticipating any guests today. If you had only called ahead, I would have ensured the gate recognized your vehicle to save you the trouble of slipping in behind the grocery delivery." I gripped his hand firmly, forcing my facial muscles to relax into a pleasant, fatherly expression. "I deeply apologize for the unannounced intrusion, Harrison," I replied smoothly. "I was simply driving through the area and realized it had been 3 weeks since the wedding. I just wanted to drop by quickly and see how my favorite daughter was settling into her beautiful new home." Harrison chuckled lightly, a hollow sound that did not reach his dead, predatory eyes. "Of course, Richard. Family is always welcome. Please come on inside. It is incredibly hot out here today." I followed him up the wide stone steps and crossed the threshold into the cavernous foyer. The immediate drop in temperature was jarring. The air conditioning blasting a sterile, perfectly filtered chill throughout the massive space. The interior was a breathtaking display of ultra-modern minimalist design. Cold Italian marble floors, vast expanses of structural glass, and stark white walls devoid of any personal warmth or character. It did not feel like a home. It felt exactly like a high-tech corporate headquarters, sterile and deeply intimidating. As soon as my heavy leather shoes stepped onto the marble floor, a soft, pleasant electronic chime echoed from hidden speakers embedded seamlessly into the ceiling architecture. The same synthesized female voice that had blocked my phone calls spoke with perfect modulated clarity. "Guest has entered the main foyer, adjusting environmental controls to accommodate increased occupancy." I paused, glancing up at the sleek, featureless ceiling. "That is quite the setup you have here, Harrison." Harrison smiled proudly, gesturing vaguely to the empty space around us. "It is my own proprietary smart home ecosystem, Richard. The entire property is fully integrated: lighting, temperature, security, communications. The artificial intelligence anticipates our every need. It tracks movement, learns our daily habits, and optimizes the environment perfectly. It is designed to provide absolute security and ultimate convenience. It is incredibly impressive." I lied, feeling a cold knot tightening in my stomach. The system was not designed for convenience. It was a highly sophisticated digital leash, a mechanism of absolute control. Just then, the soft sound of footsteps echoed from the grand floating staircase to our right. I turned and felt my breath catch sharply in my throat. Harper was walking down the steps, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor in front of her. But it was her clothing that immediately sent my engineering mind into a state of blaring red alert. Outside, the summer sun was baking the hills at a sweltering 85 degrees. Inside, the heavy air conditioning kept the house cool, but certainly not freezing. Yet my daughter was wearing a thick, heavy, oversized cashmere sweater with long sleeves pulled down tightly over her wrists, paired with dark, heavy denim pants. Her delicate frame looked swallowed up by the bulky fabric, completely contradicting the season and the environment. "Harper, sweetheart," I said, taking a step forward with my arms wide open. She looked up, and for a fleeting fraction of a second, I saw that same primal terror flashing in her eyes, before she quickly masked it with a polite, vacant smile. "Dad," she said, her voice sounding distant and strained. "What a lovely surprise." I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her into a tight, protective hug. Even through the thick, heavy layers of the cashmere sweater, I could feel how rigid and tense her body was. She felt fragile, like a supporting beam that was actively buckling under an impossible load. I kissed her cheek, my eyes darting quickly over her face. Her makeup was applied flawlessly, perfectly, concealing any physical imperfections, but the dark, hollow shadows beneath her eyes told a story of profound exhaustion and deep, unspeakable fear. "You look beautiful, Harper," I whispered softly, "but aren't you a little warm in that heavy sweater?" Before she could even open her mouth to answer, Harrison stepped up right beside her, placing that familiar, heavy structural hand firmly on her shoulder. The fabric of the sweater bunched slightly under his unyielding grip. "Oh, you know, Harper Richard," Harrison interjected smoothly. "She has always run a little cold. The climate control in the house is still calibrating, and we want to make sure she is completely comfortable." Harper nodded robotically, staring blankly at my chest. "Yes, Dad. I am just a little chilly today. It is perfectly fine." The lie was so blatantly obvious, so poorly constructed, that it took every ounce of my willpower not to confront him right there in the sterile foyer. The heavy, long-sleeved sweater was not a bizarre fashion choice or a response to the air conditioning. It was a necessary structural covering. It was specifically chosen to hide the fresh, dark bruises decorating her arms and wrists, the undeniable physical evidence of the monster standing right beside her. "Why do we not all go into the main living room?" Harrison suggested cheerfully, steering Harper forward with subtle, aggressive force. "Harper, darling, why do you not go to the kitchen and fetch your father a glass of ice water? I am sure he is parched from the long drive up the hill." "Of course," Harper replied mechanically. We moved into a sprawling, open-concept living area featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the valley. I remained standing, refusing to sink into the low, modern sofas, wanting to keep my tactical mobility intact. Harper walked over to the massive, freestanding marble kitchen island, pulling a heavy crystal glass from the pristine cabinetry. She reached toward the integrated water dispenser built into the enormous stainless steel refrigerator. I watched her hands closely. They were trembling just as they had been on the dance floor 3 weeks ago. The violent shaking was significantly worse now. She filled the heavy crystal glass, turning slowly to carry it back toward the living area. Her eyes darted nervously toward Harrison, seeking his approval or bracing for his judgment. In her state of sheer exhaustion and primal fear, her trembling fingers simply failed to maintain their grip. The heavy crystal glass slipped right through her hands. It hit the unforgiving, solid Italian marble floor with a sharp, explosive crash, shattering into 1,000 jagged, glittering pieces. Water splashed violently across the pristine stone tiles. Harper flinched so violently, her entire body contorted. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hands instantly flying up to defensively cover her face. It was the deeply ingrained involuntary reflex of someone who fully expected to be struck hard. The silence that followed the crash was deafening. I instinctively took a rapid step forward to comfort her, to tell her it was just a broken glass and completely fine. But Harrison's voice cut through the heavy air. It was not loud. It was not angry. It was terrifyingly calm, sickeningly sweet, and completely devoid of human empathy. "Harper, darling, Harrison said softly, a dark, menacing undercurrent weaving perfectly through the gentle tone. Look at this terrible mess you have made. You really must learn to be much more careful with our beautiful things. Now please be a good wife and clean this up immediately. He did not tell her to get a broom. He did not tell her to grab a towel. The dark micro-command embedded in his smooth voice was unmistakably clear. Harper immediately dropped hard onto her bare knees, right on the wet, unforgiving marble floor. She began frantically gathering the jagged, razor-sharp shards of broken crystal with her bare, trembling hands. I surged forward, unable to maintain the facade any longer. Harrison, for God's sake, she is going to severely cut herself. Let me grab a heavy towel or a broom for her. Harrison smoothly sidestepped, firmly planting his solid athletic frame directly in my path, effectively blocking my access to my kneeling daughter. Richard. Please, he said, his smile perfectly intact, while his dead eyes locked intensely onto mine. We have our own ways of managing our household. Harper knows exactly how I like things done. Do not interfere with our process. I stood frozen. My fists clenched so tightly, my fingernails bit deeply into my palms. I was standing mere feet away from my only child, watching her frantically scramble on her hands and knees, desperately picking up broken glass to appease a sadistic tyrant, and I was completely physically blocked from helping her, without inciting a violent altercation that would inevitably result in her enduring far worse punishment later. I needed to breathe. I needed a moment to aggressively suppress the roaring, blinding rage threatening to completely overwhelm my logical faculties. If I attacked him now, I would be arrested for assault, and Harper would be left entirely alone in his undisputed custody. I forced my hands to unclench. If you will excuse me for just one moment, Harrison, I said, my voice tight and strained. I urgently need to use the guest restroom. Harrison nodded graciously, gesturing toward a sleek, handleless wooden door down the adjacent hallway. Right down there on the left, Richard. Please take all the time you need. I walked swiftly down the quiet corridor, stepping inside the guest bathroom and closing the heavy door firmly behind me. I locked it, leaning back against the solid wood, closing my eyes and taking deep, ragged breaths to steady my racing heart. The bathroom was just as immaculate and sterile as the rest of the massive house. Chrome fixtures, imported stone tiling, flawless mirror lighting. I walked over to the modern sink, splashing freezing cold water onto my flushed face. As I reached for a thick cotton towel hanging on the heated rack, my trained eyes naturally scanned the architectural layout of the small room, evaluating the ventilation placement out of pure professional habit. There was a sleek, rectangular HVAC return vent installed flush against the ceiling directly above the shower stall. At first glance, it looked like a standard high-end architectural fixture. But my specialized career was built entirely on noticing microscopic deviations in standard structural designs. The dark slotted louvers of the metal vent were angled slightly incorrectly. I stepped directly beneath it, squinting up into the dark, shadowy recesses of the ductwork. Nestled quietly and deeply behind the angled metal slats, barely visible to the naked human eye, was a tiny, distinctively round, optical lens, accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible crimson dot. It was not a standard motion sensor for the lighting system. I knew exactly what that specialized hardware looked like. It was a highly sophisticated military-grade thermal imaging sensor functioning actively as an illegal, completely hidden indoor surveillance camera. My blood ran completely cold. The sickening realization hit me with the devastating force of a collapsing concrete pool. If he had a hidden thermal camera actively recording inside a private guest bathroom, they were absolutely everywhere. The entire $12 million estate was heavily wired. Every single room, every hallway, every quiet corner was constantly monitored, recorded, and meticulously analyzed by Harrison Proprietary Artificial Intelligence Network. I was standing inside a flawless, multi-million-dollar digital panopticon. I could not speak freely to Harper anywhere inside these imposing walls without Harrison hearing every single syllable. She was a captive prisoner in a high-tech cage, and the invisible bars were closing in fast. I washed my hands in the cold water, carefully drying them on the thick white towel. I took one final look at my aging reflection in the pristine mirror. I had to bury my anger deep inside my chest. I had to become the harmless, oblivious father. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and walked slowly back down the quiet corridor toward the main living room. Harrison and Harper were standing exactly where I had left them. Harrison was casually holding a new crystal glass filled with ice water, offering it to me with that manufactured smile. I politely declined, citing my slightly upset stomach. I looked at Harper. She was staring at the floor, completely defeated. "Harrison," I said, keeping my voice light and entirely casual. "I really should be getting back on the road. The afternoon traffic heading into the city is going to be terrible, and I have a few errands to run before the evening." Harrison nodded in immediate agreement, clearly thrilled that my intrusive visit was finally coming to an end. "It was wonderful of you to stop by, Richard. We are just so incredibly busy getting the house properly organized. You understand how chaotic these early days of marriage can be." I forced myself to smile. "Of course. Take good care of my daughter." We walked together toward the massive oak double doors of the front entrance. My mind was racing desperately, searching for a single fleeting opportunity to communicate with Harper. I knew the interior of the house was a complete surveillance trap. I had to get her outside even for just a few seconds. Harrison opened the heavy front door, and the sweltering heat of the summer afternoon washed over us. We stepped out onto the wide stone porch. My eyes immediately scanned the exterior architecture. As a seasoned structural engineer, I instinctively mapped out the security perimeter. I noted the sleek black dome cameras mounted under the deep eaves of the roofline. I saw the discrete motion sensors buried in the manicured flower beds. But then I looked up at the position of the late afternoon sun. It was currently hanging low on the western horizon. The intense blinding rays were striking the polished glass lens of the primary surveillance camera mounted directly above the main portico. For a brief, very specific window of time, the harsh glare of the sun would completely blind that single camera. It would white out the image entirely, creating a temporary physical blind spot right on the edge of the top stone step. I had to position Harper exactly within that narrow cone of glaring light. I turned around, stepping deliberately to my right, placing myself precisely in the center of the blinding solar reflection. I opened my arms wide. "Come here, sweetheart. Give your old man a proper hug goodbye." Harper hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing quickly at Harrison. He gave her a curt, approving nod, playing the role of the benevolent husband. She stepped forward, moving into the bright sunlight, and wrapped her arms around my neck. I pulled her tightly against my chest, turning my back slightly to shield her face from Harrison's line of sight. We were standing perfectly within the temporary blind spot of the overhead camera. I expected her to cry. I expected her to tremble. But the woman holding on to me suddenly transformed. The rigid, terrified posture vanished for exactly 2 seconds. She pressed her lips directly against my right ear, her breath hot and urgent. She did not whisper a desperate plea. She did not ask for the police. She spoke with a rapid clinical precision that stunned me. Latitude 34.052, longitude 118.243, locker number 402. Do not call me. Go today. Oh. The words were a continuous, rapid-fire stream of critical information. It was not a phone number. It was a precise set of geographical coordinates and a specific locker number. Before I could even process the absolute magnitude of what she had just said, she pulled away from me. Her face instantly reverted to the blank, terrified mask she had been wearing all afternoon. "I love you, Dad," she said in a dull, robotic voice. "Drive safely." "I love you too, Harper," I replied, my voice steady despite the massive adrenaline spike flooding my system. I looked at Harrison, giving him a polite nod. "Thank you for the brief tour, Harrison. You have a very impressive property here." "We aim for absolute perfection, Richard," he replied smoothly. "Have a good trip home." I turned my back on them and began walking down the wide stone steps toward my parked sedan. I committed the numbers to memory, repeating them over and over in my mind like a sacred mantra. latitude 34.052, longitude 118.243, locker number 402. My daughter was not broken. She was fighting back from inside the cage, and she had just handed me the key. I reached the crushed gravel of the motor court, my hand extended toward the door handle of my car. Suddenly, the distinct sound of heavy tactical boots crunching on the loose gravel broke the quiet atmosphere of the estate. I stopped and turned my head slowly. Two men had emerged silently from the dense, thick tree line bordering the front lawn. They were not standard neighborhood security guards. They wore dark, tactical clothing, heavy combat boots, and black sunglasses. Their posture was incredibly rigid, their hands resting comfortably near the thick waistbands of their pants, where the unmistakable outlines of concealed firearms were clearly visible beneath their dark shirts. They moved with the calculated, synchronized precision of highly trained military contractors. They walked purposefully toward my car, effectively blocking my path to the driver's side door. The taller of the two men stopped exactly 3 feet away from me. He removed his dark sunglasses, revealing cold, emotionless eyes. "Mr. Stanton," the tall man said. His voice was deep, polite, and heavily laced with a menacing, undeniable threat. "Mr. Thorne asked us to kindly escort you off the property. He also asked us to personally deliver a message regarding any future visits you might be planning to make." I stood my ground, refusing to let my posture betray any signs of intimidation. I crossed my arms over my chest, looking the man directly in his cold eyes. "I am listening." "This property is a highly secure private residential facility," the man continued, his tone remaining perfectly level. "Unannounced visits pose a significant disruption to the established security protocols. Moving forward, if you arrive at these gates without a prior verified appointment, directly approved by Mr. Thorne himself, your presence will be legally classified as criminal trespassing. The local authorities will be notified immediately, and you will be forcefully removed from the premises. Do you completely understand this policy, sir?" They were drawing a permanent line in the sand. They were officially cutting me off from the only physical location where I could breathe the same air as my daughter. I looked past the two armed contractors, casting my gaze back up the long stone driveway. The massive oak front doors were already tightly closed. Harrison and Harper were gone, sealed away behind layers of impenetrable technology and thick structural walls. "I understand perfectly," I told the contractor, my voice carrying a quiet, dangerous edge that I did not try to hide. "I will not be dropping by unannounced ever again." The tall man nodded slowly, stepping aside to clear my path to the car door. "Have a very safe drive back to the city, Mr. Stanton." I opened my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I did not look at the two men as I put the vehicle into drive. I slowly steered my car down the long, winding private road, leaving the imposing multi-million-dollar mansion behind me. The amber pulsing security lights seemed to track my every move, guiding me outward, like a highly unwanted intruder, being expelled from a restricted zone. When I finally reached the bottom of the steep hill, the massive steel security gates began to glide open, triggered by the automated departure sensors. I drove my car through the heavy iron threshold, pulling out onto the quiet public road. I stopped the vehicle on the shoulder and looked up into the rearview mirror. I watched in total silence as the massive steel panels slid together, locking firmly into place with a loud, heavy mechanical clank that echoed through the quiet forest. The heavy physical barrier was completely sealed. The digital panopticon was fully operational. I was officially locked out on the outside, sitting alone in my car on a quiet country road. But as I stared at those locked iron gates, I did not feel defeated. I did not feel the crushing despair that Harrison Thorne had clearly intended for me to feel. I felt a cold, deep, unyielding resolve hardening inside my chest. Harrison believed that by controlling the physical access points and the digital environment, he had completely neutralized the only threat to his perfect facade. He honestly believed that an aging, retired structural engineer was absolutely powerless against his private army, his billions of dollars, and his sophisticated artificial intelligence network. He was profoundly, catastrophically wrong. He had severely underestimated who he was dealing with. He only saw an old man in a cheap suit. He did not see the man who had spent 4 decades calculating the invisible breaking points of massive concrete structures. He did not realize that every single fortress ever built in the history of human civilization had a fatal fundamental flaw hidden somewhere deep within its foundation. I knew how to find those flaws. I knew how to apply the exact amount of localized pressure required to bring an entire structure crashing down into total ruin. I reached into my pocket, pulling out a small notepad and a pen. I carefully wrote down the numbers Harper had desperately whispered into my ear. Latitude 34.052. Longitude 118.243. Locker number 402. This was not the end of the line. This was the absolute beginning. I put my car into drive and accelerated down the winding road, leaving the massive steel gates far behind in the dust. I knew I could never go back through the front door of that cursed estate. I would never be welcomed inside as a loving father ever again. The polite, fragile illusion of family diplomacy was completely shattered. The quiet, invisible boundaries had been drawn. My daughter was trapped inside a digital nightmare, holding on to a terrifying secret, and relying entirely on me to decipher her hidden message before the invisible ticking clock ran out. The secret war had officially begun. I drove toward the city limits, my mind rapidly calculating the geographical coordinates. I needed to find out exactly where those numbers led, and I needed to do it without leaving a single digital trace that Harrison's sophisticated network could ever track. I was an analog man stepping onto a highly advanced digital battlefield, but I had one massive advantage that his artificial intelligence could never possibly predict or comprehend. I had the ruthless, unstoppable determination of a father who was fully prepared to burn the entire world to ashes to save his little girl. The monster hiding inside that smart home had taken my daughter, but he had absolutely no idea what kind of storm he had just invited to his front door. I drove straight through the night, leaving the manicured lawns and towering gates of the wealthy suburbs far behind me. The coordinates Harper had whispered into my ear did not lead to a bank vault or a high-end storage facility. They pointed to the opposite end of the city, to a decaying, forgotten sector of the industrial district that most people actively avoided after dark. I parked my car 2 blocks away from the destination, making sure to choose a poorly lit side street with broken street lamps. I walked the remaining distance, pulling the collar of my coat up against the damp, biting wind coming off the harbor. The coordinates terminated at an old rundown bus terminal that looked like it had not seen a fresh coat of paint or a cleaning crew in 3 decades. The flickering neon sign above the entrance hummed with a defective, erratic buzz. I pushed through the heavy glass doors. The interior smelled of stale cigarette smoke, cheap floor cleaner, and deep neglect. A few exhausted travelers slept on rigid plastic benches, completely ignoring me as I walked past them. I moved purposefully toward the back wall, scanning the rows of dented, rust-covered storage lockers. I found locker 402. It was located in the darkest corner of the terminal, partially obscured by a broken vending machine. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the crumpled note still resting there. Harper had not given me a physical key, which meant it had to be a combination lock. I stood in front of the rusted metal door and took a deep breath. I thought back to the wedding day, to the specific dates and numbers that meant something to us. I punched in the month and year of her mother passing. The mechanical lock clicked heavily, releasing the steel latch. I pulled the small metal door open. The locker was entirely empty except for a single small object resting right in the center of the dusty metal floor. It was a standard black USB flash drive. I picked it up, feeling its light weight in the palm of my hand. This tiny piece of plastic and metal was the reason my daughter was currently living in a state of sheer terror. I slipped the drive securely into my inner coat pocket and quickly walked out of the terminal, blending back into the dark shadows of the city streets. My immediate instinct was to drive straight home, plug the flash drive into my personal desktop computer, and see exactly what Harrison Thorne was hiding. But my structural engineering background had trained me to respect unseen hazards. Harrison was a ruthless billionaire tech mogul who specialized in highly sophisticated artificial intelligence and digital surveillance. If I plugged this drive into any machine connected to the internet, his proprietary algorithms would likely trace my IP address within seconds. He would know exactly what I possessed, and he would eliminate the threat before I could even read the first file. I needed an isolated, secure environment. I needed an expert who knew how to handle digital explosives. I drove north, leaving the city entirely. I drove for 3 solid hours into the deep, heavily forested mountains, navigating winding dirt logging roads that were not listed on any modern GPS map. My destination was a secluded off-the-grid wooden cabin completely surrounded by towering pine trees. There was no cell phone reception out here. There were no power lines. The entire property ran on hidden solar panels and a noisy diesel generator. This isolated fortress belonged to Thomas. Thomas was a heavily paranoid, highly skilled, retired cybercrimes agent who had spent 20 years hunting digital ghosts for the federal government. We were not just casual friends. 32 years ago, a poorly constructed commercial parking garage had collapsed during a massive earthquake. I had been brought in to evaluate the structural stability of the devastating wreckage. Thomas had been trapped under 3 tons of crushed concrete and twisted steel rebar. The rescue crews said the debris was too unstable that shifting the load would crush him instantly. I had spent 14 agonizing hours mathematically calculating the precise tension angles, directing the heavy machinery millimeter by millimeter until we pulled him out alive. Thomas owed me his life, and he had promised me that if I ever needed a ghost, he would be there. I pulled up to the dark cabin and stepped out into the freezing mountain air. Before I even reached the front porch, the solid oak door opened. Thomas stood there wrapped in a heavy flannel shirt holding a tactical flashlight. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, but his eyes were just as sharp and analytical as I remembered. Richard, Thomas said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "You are a very long way from civilization. What kind of trouble are you in?" "The worst kind," I replied, walking past him into the warm, cluttered cabin. "I have a digital payload, and I need to crack it open without alerting the architect who built the bomb." Thomas locked the heavy deadbolts behind us and motioned for me to follow him down a narrow flight of wooden stairs into a reinforced basement. The basement was a technological bunker completely lined with copper mesh to create a flawless Faraday cage. No wireless signals could enter or exit this room. It was a complete digital vacuum. He walked over to a heavy steel desk that held a thick, ruggedized laptop computer. "This machine has never touched a network in its entire existence," Thomas explained, sliding into the chair and booting up the terminal. "Hand it over." I pulled the black USB drive from my pocket and placed it on the steel desk. Thomas looked at it with deep suspicion, treating it like a venomous snake. He plugged it into an isolated port and began running a series of complex diagnostic protocols. Lines of green code cascaded rapidly down the dark screen. "Your target is not messing around, Richard." Thomas muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard with incredible speed. "This drive is wrapped in military-grade encryption. If I enter the wrong sequence, the payload is programmed to instantly wipe itself clean. It is a highly aggressive digital self-destruct mechanism." "Can you bypass it?" I asked, stepping closer to look over his shoulder. "I did not spend 20 years hunting federal hackers to get beaten by a commercial tech boy," Thomas replied confidently. He launched a brute force decryption algorithm, letting his customized software hammer against the digital walls of the flash drive. We stood there in the quiet basement, watching the progress bar crawl forward painfully slowly. After 45 agonizing minutes, the screen flashed a brilliant green. The primary security shell cracked open. Thomas exhaled a sharp breath. "We are in. Let us see what your son-in-law is trying so hard to bury." He opened the root directory. The drive was packed with thousands of heavily fragmented files. Thomas isolated a single massive spreadsheet and opened it. The screen filled with endless columns of names, dates, and staggering financial figures. It was a highly detailed ledger. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the endless rows of data. "These are offshore wire transfers," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a serious clinical whisper. Millions of dollars moving through untraceable shell companies in the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, and Switzerland. The sheer volume of liquid capital moving through these accounts is staggering. This is not standard corporate accounting, Richard. This is a massive, highly illegal financial washing machine. But why, I asked, my mind racing. Why would Harrison Thorne, a billionaire, need to illegally wash this much liquid cash? Thomas shook his head. There is a master folder here labeled with a random sequence of alphanumeric characters. If we open this folder, we will find the absolute core of his entire operation. We will know where this money comes from and who he pays. He double-clicked the master folder. A bright red warning prompt instantly locked the screen. Thomas cursed softly, leaning back in his chair. What is it? I demanded, feeling a cold wave of dread wash over me. It is a deeply embedded secondary vault, Thomas explained. The initial encryption was just the outer gate. This specific folder requires a biometric bypass or a spoken vocal passcode. There is no digital backdoor for this security level. We cannot brute force it. The system requires Harper to speak the exact passcode phrase. She is the only person who possesses the key, I said quietly, the grim reality settling into my chest. And she is locked inside a surveillance prison, Thomas replied grimly. I cannot securely text her, and I cannot walk through the front door ever again. So I will have to find another way to communicate with my daughter, from within the very walls of his impenetrable fortress. I left Thomas behind, securing the wooden door of his copper-lined basement, and drove my car back down the winding mountain roads. My incredibly bright high-beam headlights violently cut through the incredibly thick, ancient pine trees, heavily bordering the narrow, twisting gravel path. But my mind was entirely focused on the imposing digital fortress Harrison Thorne had masterfully constructed. Thomas had made the reality of the situation absolutely clear. We could not hack into Harrison network from the outside. The encryption was military-grade, and any external digital assault would instantly trigger a massive security lockdown. Harrison had transformed that $12 million estate into a technological marvel. I knew the perimeter was guarded by high-definition motion trackers, thermal imaging cameras, and sophisticated wireless sniffers designed to detect any unauthorized frequency within a 2-mile radius. He had effectively created a flawless, impenetrable digital shield around my daughter. If I tried to smuggle a cellular device to her, the network would isolate and flag the signal before she could even dial my number. If I tried to send a drone over the property line, the automated defenses would track its flight path and dispatch security contractors in a matter of seconds. I could not fight him in the digital realm. That was his undisputed domain. He possessed billions of dollars and an army of brilliant programmers who spent their entire lives writing code to keep the outside world firmly locked out. But as I navigated the treacherous curves of the mountain highway, a different kind of logic began to surface in my mind. Harrison understood data. He understood algorithms, artificial intelligence, and invisible wireless networks. But he did not understand dirt. He simply did not understand the dense, incredibly heavy reality of deeply reinforced concrete, the massive tensile strength of expertly forged industrial steel, or the absolute physical limitations of the uneven earth his modern glowing castle was built upon. He was a man who lived entirely in the clouds, completely detached from the heavy, unyielding bedrock buried deep beneath his imported marble floors. I arrived back at my modest home just as the early morning sun slowly began to bleed over the city skyline. I did not go inside to sleep. My body was exhausted, aching from the deep stress of the past 24 hours, but my mind was operating with a sharp, singular clarity. I walked straight past my front door and headed directly around the side of the house toward my detached garage. The air inside the garage was stale and heavy with the familiar comforting scent of old motor oil and dried sawdust. I walked slowly past the impeccably neat rows of polished hand tools, heavy grease-stained power equipment, and several large, incredibly heavy steel toolboxes that I had not opened in over 5 long years, moving deliberately toward the back wall, where I kept my extensive professional archives. Stacked incredibly high on sturdy hand-built wooden shelves were dozens of thick, heavy cylindrical cardboard tubes. They contained the entire physical history of my 40-year career in commercial structural engineering. Every single major commercial and residential project I had ever personally supervised over 4 decades was meticulously recorded and securely preserved inside these heavy-weathered cardboard tubes. I dragged a tall aluminum stepladder over to the corner and climbed up, scanning the faded handwritten labels taped to the end caps of the dusty cylinders. I was looking for a specific residential project from 15 years ago, long before the property had been purchased and aggressively retrofitted by my arrogant son-in-law. It took me nearly 20 minutes of shifting heavy tubes, sneezing through clouds of disturbed dust, before my fingers finally brushed against a thick, faded blue cylinder marked with the original lot number of the hillside estate. I pulled the heavy tube down from the highest shelf and carried it over to my large wooden workbench. I cleared away a scattered pile of old wrenches and metal clamps, wiping the dusty surface clean with the sleeve of my jacket. My calloused hands were remarkably steady as I firmly popped the incredibly tight white plastic cap off the top of the blue cylinder and slowly, carefully slid the rolled architectural documents out into the harsh morning light. They were authentic physical paper blueprints, the kind of heavy, detailed architectural schematics that modern developers rarely used anymore. I unrolled the thick, oversized pages, pinning the corners down with heavy steel bolts to keep them flat against the rough wooden table. I clicked on the bright, articulated work lamp hanging above the bench, illuminating the intricate blue and white lines of the foundational schematics. For the next 3 hours, I completely lost myself in the complex geometry of the estate. I traced my calloused fingers over the precise topographical maps, reviewing the specific load-bearing calculations I had personally drafted a decade and a half ago. I looked at the exact placement of the deep steel pilings, the heavy retaining walls, and the complicated underground utility corridors that fed water and power into the massive structure. Harrison had spent a massive fortune upgrading the visible portions of the house. He had installed flawless glass walls, imported stone floors, and a network of invisible cameras. But he had not demolished the original foundation. You cannot simply rewrite a structural foundation with computer code. The original bones of the house were still exactly where my former construction crew had poured them. I carefully cross-referenced the incredibly detailed foundational blueprints with the vivid mental map I had meticulously constructed during my brief, absolutely terrifying visit to the estate. I knew Harrison had converted the primary basement level into his heavily guarded server room, sealing it behind biometric locks and motion sensors. I knew he had placed thermal cameras in the ventilation ducts to detect any human heat signatures moving through the house. His digital security web was incredibly thorough, but as my eyes traced the thick blue lines detailing the original subterranean utility grid, I suddenly stopped. My finger hovered over a specific isolated section of the lower foundational plan. It was an old secondary heating and ventilation shaft, located deep beneath the eastern wing of the house, directly under the master bedroom suite. According to the original construction notes, this specific utility shaft had been permanently decommissioned shortly after the foundational pour due to a last-minute change in the architectural zoning permits. The developer had rerouted the primary air conditioning system to a higher floor, leaving this underground corridor completely abandoned. But because it was structurally integrated directly into the primary retaining wall, supporting the hillside, it could not be safely removed or demolished without compromising the entire estate. Instead, it had been heavily encased in a massive uninterrupted pour of load-bearing rebar-reinforced concrete. I stared at the precise material specifications written in the margins of the blueprint. The walls of this abandoned shaft were exactly 12 inches thick, composed entirely of ultra-high-density concrete and a tight grid of heavy forged steel rebar. A slow, grim realization began to form in my chest. Harrison Thorne relied entirely on wireless digital signals, high-frequency thermal imaging, and advanced radio frequencies to maintain his flawless security grid. But standard wireless signals, thermal radiation, and radio frequencies simply cannot penetrate 12 inches of high-density steel reinforced concrete. The physical properties of the heavy building materials act as a massive natural Faraday cage, effectively blocking all external and internal transmissions. That thick concrete tomb was a massive naturally occurring black hole in his otherwise perfect digital empire. It was the one place on the entire sprawling property where a thermal camera could not sense body heat and where a wireless motion detector could not transmit an alarm signal back to the main server. It was the only structural blind spot in the entire $12 million digital fortress. I knew from my brief visit that Harrison had moved Harper into the primary master suite on the ground floor, ostensibly for her convenience, but effectively isolating her from the rest of the sprawling house. The decommissioned ventilation shaft ran directly beneath the imported hardwood floors of that exact bedroom. It terminated at a rusted iron grate hidden deep within the foundational crawl space right below where she slept. If I could somehow get inside that specific decommissioned shaft from the outside of the property line, I could physically bypass his entire multi-million-dollar security apparatus without ever crossing his heavily monitored threshold. I grabbed a small metal ruler from my workbench and carefully measured the scaled architectural drawing of the abandoned concrete shaft. I needed to know exactly how much physical clearance I would have once I managed to breach the exterior grate. I placed the ruler against the blueprint, my heart sinking heavily as I completed the quick mathematical conversion in my head. The interior dimensions of the concrete utility shaft were agonizingly small. It was barely 20 inches wide and 24 inches tall. It was not designed for human traversal. It was a dark, suffocating pipe meant only for industrial airflow. I stared down at my calloused, aging hands resting on the dusty workbench. I am 70 years old. My joints are stiff, my shoulders constantly ache from decades of hard physical labor, and my lungs are not what they used to be. The absolutely terrifying reality of what I actually had to do immediately settled heavily over me like a thick, suffocating lead blanket. To reach the ventilation grate located directly beneath the bedroom of my daughter, I would have to force my aging body into that incredibly narrow, pitch-black concrete pipe. I would have to drag myself forward inch by agonizing inch through absolute darkness, completely surrounded by thousands of pounds of crushing stone and steel. If my shoulders wedged tightly against the rough concrete, if the stale air trapped inside the pipe proved insufficient, or if I simply got irreversibly stuck in the deep subterranean darkness, absolutely no one would ever hear me scream. I would slowly suffocate alone, buried alive directly underneath the bedroom of my daughter, and Harrison Thorne would win completely. I slowly lowered my heavy head into my violently trembling hands, finally realizing with absolute, deeply terrifying clarity that to save my only beautiful child, I was going to have to willingly crawl straight into a suffocating, claustrophobic concrete tomb. The morning sun was blinding by the time I finalized my desperate strategy. Digital hacking would fail against the massive defenses Harrison had installed. My only option was a physical breach during a controlled blackout. I drove to a municipal maintenance yard. It was easy to slip into the unsecured locker room while the shift crews dispatched their trucks. I borrowed a faded yellow water department uniform complete with a hard hat and reflective vest. It was perfect urban camouflage. No one questions an old man in a yellow vest holding a heavy wrench. I parked my sedan a quarter-mile down the hill from the Thorne estate. I put on the stolen uniform, grabbed my canvas tool bag, and began the grueling walk up the winding road. The midday heat was punishing, but I kept my head down, moving with the slow pace of a tired city worker. I approached the subterranean utility junction box located on public land outside the massive steel security gates. This box housed the main water supply lines and the primary electrical conduits feeding the backup generators. I knelt beside the steel access panel, snapping the cheap padlock with my pry bar. I pulled the metal cover aside, exposing a massive web of rubber pipes and copper wiring. By tampering with the high-pressure water valve and forcing a surge of pressurized water directly into the electrical conduit housing, I could trigger a short circuit. The resulting power surge would trip the main breakers at the municipal substation, knocking out the neighborhood grid. Harrison's system would detect the failure and switch to the backup generators. I had calculated the physical lag time. I would have exactly 10 minutes of darkness before the diesel generators, fully engaged, and rebooted the digital panopticon. I gripped the heavy steel water valve, taking a deep breath of summer air. I violently wrenched the heavy wheel, left snapping the pressure seal. A jet of highly pressurized water exploded outward, soaking my uniform instantly. I forcefully directed the stream straight into the electrical housing. The reaction was immediate and violently spectacular. A shower of bright blue sparks erupted from the wiring, followed by a loud crack that sounded like a rifle shot. The street lamps lining the road instantly died. I looked up the hill. The pulsing amber security lights surrounding the Thorne estate flickered before plunging into absolute darkness. The 10-minute countdown had begun. I grabbed my canvas bag and ran. I abandoned the methodical walk, sprinting through the tree line bordering the property. My 70-year-old lungs burned with every sharp breath, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I navigated the steep, rocky perimeter, moving rapidly through the thick brush until I reached the concrete retaining wall anchoring the eastern wing. I dropped to my knees, frantically digging my gloved hands into the damp soil accumulated at the base of the slab. I pushed aside layers of dead leaves and wet dirt until my fingers scraped against cold, rusted iron. It was the exterior grate of the decommissioned ventilation shaft. I jammed the flat edge of my steel pry bar behind the heavy iron rim. I braced my boots against the solid concrete wall, putting my entire body weight into the lever. The ancient rusted bolts shrieked in protest, the horrible sound echoing loudly in the silent, darkened forest. I gritted my teeth, pulling back with every ounce of strength I possessed in my aching shoulders. With a loud snap, the iron grate gave way, falling backward into the wet dirt. I aimed my flashlight into the narrow opening. The beam barely penetrated the thick, suffocating darkness. The square concrete tunnel was incredibly small, measuring 20 inches across. It looked like a crushing tomb. I took one last deep breath of the night air, forced my shoulders down, and pushed myself head-first into the pitch-black tunnel. The transition was shocking. The heavy concrete walls instantly pressed aggressively against my shoulders and hips, severely restricting my movement. The air inside the shaft was completely dead thick, with decades of accumulated dust and the metallic taste of old rust. I dragged myself forward, using my elbows and the tips of my boots, moving inch by agonizing inch into the crushing darkness. Every joint in my aging body screamed in violent protest. The rough concrete scraped mercilessly against my back, tearing through the fabric of my stolen uniform. The dense, unyielding walls felt like they were closing in on me, threatening to crush my chest and permanently bury me beneath the massive weight of the estate. Blinding panic began to rise in the back of my throat. My breathing became rapid and shallow, the thick dust clogging my desperate lungs. I stopped moving, squeezing my eyes shut in the total darkness. I was suffocating. I could not do this. I was too old, too frail, too terrified. But then, in the crushing silence of that dark concrete tomb, I remembered the beautiful face of my late wife, Evelyn. I remembered her holding Harper when she was just a fragile newborn baby. I remembered the fierce light in Evelyn's eyes, the undeniable promise we had both silently made to protect our little girl from every monster in the world. Evelyn would not quit. She would not let the darkness win. I opened my eyes in the pitch-black shaft. I swallowed the choking panic, forcing my breathing to slow down. I pushed my bloody elbows against the rough concrete and dragged my heavy body forward once again. I was coming for my daughter. I crawled for what felt like an eternity, losing all sense of time and physical direction in the suffocating blackness. Finally, my flashlight beam reflected off a solid barrier ahead of me. I had reached the end of the shaft. Directly above my head was a slatted metal vent leading straight up into the master bedroom. I rolled onto my back, wincing as my bruised spine scraped against the hard stone. I reached into my canvas tool bag, pulling out the device Thomas had built for me. It was not a modern digital wireless bug. If I planted anything broadcasting a radio frequency or wireless internet signal, Harrison's sophisticated network would instantly detect the rogue transmission the second the power came back online. Instead, Thomas had modified an old analog low-frequency radio transmitter salvaged from Cold War-era surveillance hardware. It ran on a dedicated internal battery and broadcasted on an obsolete analog frequency band that modern digital sniffers simply did not monitor or recognize. I pressed the heavy magnetic base of the analog transmitter firmly against the solid steel housing of the bedroom vent. I flipped the small toggle switch, confirming the faint green indicator light was actively glowing. The device was secured, completely hidden within the 12 inches of solid signal blocking concrete. It was the only blind spot in Harrison Digital Empire, and I had claimed it. I checked the glowing dial of my wristwatch. 8 minutes and 30 seconds had passed. The 10-minute blackout window was closing. I grabbed my empty canvas tool bag and began the painful process of crawling backward down the narrow concrete shaft. Moving backward was exponentially harder. My boots slipped wildly against the smooth dust, and my torn shoulders burned with fiery agony. I pushed frantically, knowing the diesel generators could engage at any given second. Suddenly, a deep mechanical vibration rumbled through the thick concrete walls surrounding me. A loud electronic hum filled the air. The blackout was over. The estate power clicked back on. Directly behind me, deep inside the tunnel, a massive industrial ventilation fan violently shuddered to life. The heavy steel blades began spinning rapidly, pulling a hurricane-force suction of air through the narrow pipe. The deafening roar of the blades was terrifying. The powerful suction forcefully dragged my canvas bag backward toward the deadly shredding metal. I screamed, kicking my boots frantically against the walls, propelling my body backward with a burst of desperate adrenaline. My boots kicked empty air. I grabbed the exterior edge of the tunnel and threw my body backward out of the hole, landing heavily in the dirt, just as the roaring fan reached deadly velocity. I scrambled away from the dark opening covered in mud, blood, and concrete dust. I lay flat on my back, gasping for air, staring up at the pulsing amber security lights that had just re-illuminated the massive property. I had planted the bug. I had survived the tunnel. But as I rolled over to crawl back toward the dark forest, a blinding white flashlight beam cut through the trees, locking onto my face. "Hey!" a deep, aggressive voice shouted loudly through the dark woods. "Stay exactly where you are. Do not move a single muscle." I froze completely in the mud, staring blindly into the harsh, piercing light. I had successfully breached the digital fortress, but I failed to escape the physical perimeter. I was caught. The intense, blinding white light pinned me aggressively to the cold, damp earth. I squeezed my eyes shut tightly, raising a trembling, muddy hand to shield my face from the harsh glare. The towering security contractor stepped out from the thick shadows, his hand resting menacingly on the dark grip of his holstered weapon. "What in the hell are you doing out here, old man?" he demanded, his deep voice slicing sharply through the freezing cold night air. I forced my breathing to slow, leaning heavily on my age and the stolen yellow municipal utility uniform. I let out a loud, ragged groan of pain, slowly pushing myself up into a clumsy, seated position. The main pressure valve completely blew out. I grumbled, injecting my voice with the perfect mix of exhaustion and irritation. The entire neighborhood grid shorted out when the water hit the electrical conduits. I was checking the perimeter drains to make sure the runoff was not flooding the basement. The guard kept the blinding light fixed on my face for a long moment. He scanned the canvas tool bag slung across my chest, the reflective yellow stripes of my vest, and the dirt-caked boots I was wearing. The estate had just suffered a power failure, making my fabricated story incredibly plausible. "You are trespassing on private property," the guard barked, though the tension in his posture softened by a fraction. "The perimeter is completely secure. Get your gear and get back to the public road immediately before I call the local authorities." I nodded my head, slowly offering him a tired, apologetic wave. "Just doing my job tonight, buddy. I will get right out of your hair." I turned my back, forcing myself to walk at a slow pace down the rocky hill, resisting every instinct that told me to sprint. I felt his flashlight tracking my movements until I crossed back over the property line. I reached my sedan, threw the canvas bag into the trunk, and immediately drove away from the wealthy suburbs. I navigated the dark roads until I reached a desolate commercial parking lot about 1 mile away from the sprawling estate. Thomas was waiting for me there, sitting quietly in the driver's seat of an unmarked matte black surveillance van. I parked my car, climbed into the back of his heavily modified vehicle, and locked the doors behind me. The interior of the van was completely stripped of standard seating, replaced by a bank of glowing monitors, audio receivers, and complex decryption hardware. "Did you plant the hardware?" Thomas asked, his eyes never leaving the glowing green waves of an audio frequency analyzer. I nodded, wiping a smear of dried mud from my forehead. "It is secured directly beneath her bedroom floorboards. It is encased in 12 inches of solid concrete." "Turn it on." Thomas flipped a sequence of heavy metal toggle switches on the main control board. He slowly twisted a large analog tuning dial, filtering out the heavy digital noise of the surrounding city. For a few tense, agonizing moments, the speakers only broadcasted a harsh, abrasive wall of white static. Then quite suddenly, the static broke. It was not the crystal-clear, flawless audio of a modern digital stream. It was scratchy, heavily distorted, and washed in a faint, continuous analog hiss. But through that veil of vintage radio interference, the unmistakable sound of a heavy door slamming shut echoed loudly inside the small van. I held my breath, leaning forward until my face was merely inches away from the primary speaker. Harper Harrison's voice crackled through the analog speaker. The sickeningly sweet, manufactured tone he used for the public was completely gone. His voice was a low, vibrating growl of pure, unrestrained malice. "Do you have any idea how close you came to ruining everything today? Your clumsy, pathetic little display in the kitchen in front of your father was absolutely unacceptable." I heard the sharp, terrifying sound of glass shattering against a hard surface, followed instantly by my daughter's terrified, breathless gasp. "I am sorry," Harper sobbed, her voice trembling so violently it physically hurt my heart to hear it. I was just startled. "I am so tired, Harrison. Please just let me sleep. You do not get to sleep." Harrison snapped his heavy footsteps, pacing aggressively back and forth across the hardwood floor, directly above the hidden microphone. "You do not get to be tired. You are my wife. You are the beautiful, flawless, smiling face of this operation. You have one simple job, Harper. Just one. And yet you cannot even manage to hold a simple glass of water without acting like a frightened animal." I heard the sickening sound of a heavy physical impact, a solid strike that forced a sharp, muffled cry of pure agony from my daughter. My hands balled into tight fists, my fingernails drawing fresh blood from my palms. I wanted to rip the heavy metal door off the van, drive my car straight through his massive steel gates, and tear him apart with my bare hands. Thomas placed a firm restraining hand on my shoulder, his grip tight and grounding. "Listen," Richard Thomas whispered urgently. "Listen to what he is saying." "You think I am just some lucky software developer?" Harrison sneered, his voice dripping with absolute poisonous arrogance. "You think I built this massive empire by simply selling smart home convenience to wealthy idiots? You are just as naive as your pathetic father. The entire smart home ecosystem is a flawless, invisible Trojan horse." The audio feed hissed with static, but his terrifying confession cut through the noise with chilling clarity. Every single politician, every rival, corporate executive, and every wealthy elite who purchased my proprietary security system unwittingly paid me millions of dollars to wiretap their own private sanctuaries. The system does not just regulate the temperature and turn on the lights, Harper. It actively records every single whispered conversation, every illicit affair, and every corrupt backroom deal. The thermal imaging cameras, the biometric scanners, and the wireless network sniffers harvest a continuous stream of deeply compromising data. I have compiled massive encrypted digital dossiers on the most powerful, influential men in this country. I do not sell software, Harper. I sell silence. I run the largest, most sophisticated, and entirely invisible blackmail ring in the modern world. My blood ran completely cold. The sprawling $12 million estate was not a testament to his legitimate technological genius. It was a massive, highly fortified command center for a staggering criminal enterprise. The millions of dollars moving through the offshore wire transfers on the decrypted USB drive were not legitimate corporate profits. They were extortion payments. They were massive sums of untraceable blood money, extorted directly from powerful men who were absolutely terrified of having their darkest secrets exposed to the public. Harrison Thorne was not a tech visionary. He was a digital parasite feeding on the corruption of the elite. "And you," Harrison continued, his voice dropping to a sinister, mocking whisper, "you had to go snooping where you did not belong. You were just looking for your stupid wedding registry documents, and you managed to stumble blindly into the primary physical server room. You saw the ledger. You saw the video files. You saw exactly what I truly am." A very heavy, suffocating silence filled the audio feed, broken only by Harper's quiet, desperate weeping. "That is exactly why we rushed the wedding, my sweet, beautiful bride," Harrison said, his tone thick with cruel satisfaction. "I could not simply dispose of you after you discovered the truth. It would have drawn far too much unwanted attention. But a legal marriage solves everything. Your highly respectable working-class family background provides the absolute perfect shield of wholesome legitimacy for my public image. And more importantly, the sacred legal doctrine of spousal privilege completely prevents you from ever testifying against me in a court of law. You are legally bound to me. You are trapped. If you try to run, if you try to speak to your father, or if you even look at a police officer, I will release the footage of what I did to you, and I will destroy everyone you love." I stared blindly at the glowing audio receiver in the dark surveillance van. The agonizing truth dropped like a devastating bomb, shattering every single remaining illusion I held. I finally realized my only beautiful daughter was not just enduring a highly toxic, abusive marriage. She was now a truly desperate hostage held captive by a ruthless criminal mastermind who was actively holding the entire city hostage. The deadly stakes had instantly skyrocketed beyond a simple rescue mission. This situation was no longer just a desperate personal war for my daughter's basic survival. It was now a massive, absolutely righteous crusade, and I was fully prepared to burn his entire digital empire down to the bare, smoldering ash, no matter the personal cost. Thomas and I sat completely paralyzed in the dark surveillance van as the analog audio feed hissed quietly through the heavy speakers. The menacing sound of heavy boots pacing across the master bedroom floor echoed from the hidden concrete shaft. Harrison stopped pacing, exhaling a sharp, heavy breath that vibrated through the low-frequency microphone. The perfectly polished, untouchable billionaire facade was cracking. I heard the dangerous, frantic edge of a cornered predator bleeding into his usually smooth voice. He was furious, completely enraged by a massive, catastrophic failure in his flawless criminal empire that he could no longer control. He told Harper that his invisible blackmail ring had hit a terrifying, highly dangerous snag. He had grown arrogant, incredibly greedy, and he had wiretapped the wrong foreign diplomat. Now a ruthless, heavily armed international syndicate was squeezing him aggressively for massive extortion payments. They did not want digital currency or untraceable corporate stock options. They demanded hard liquid cash immediately. Harrison was wealthy on paper, but his actual liquid assets were frozen in complex, deeply monitored offshore holding companies. The dangerous foreign syndicate was quickly losing all patience, threatening to violently dismantle his life and his pristine corporate empire. Harrison let out a dry, soulless laugh that made the blood freeze in my veins. He softly told my terrified daughter that she was going to solve his immediate liquidity crisis permanently. I heard the sharp wooden sound of a heavy dresser drawer sliding open. A thick stack of paper documents dropped very loudly onto a glass table. Harrison proudly revealed that he had recently finalized a massive, comprehensive life insurance policy on her. It was a flawless corporate contract worth exactly $20 million, payable completely and immediately in liquid cash upon her sudden, tragic, and untimely accidental demise. He laid out his gruesome, highly calculated murder plot with the terrifying cold precision of a corporate boardroom presentation. In exactly 48 hours this coming Friday evening, they were scheduled to take his private luxury motor yacht out of the harbor. They would sail deep into international waters under the romantic guise of a beautiful weekend getaway. He had already checked the maritime meteorological reports meticulously. A severe, fast-moving squall was officially predicted to hit the dark coast late Friday night. He was going to use the violent weather perfectly to mask his horrific, unforgivable, and brutal crime. He described in vivid, agonizing detail exactly how my beautiful daughter was going to tragically slip on the wet wooden deck. She would fall overboard into the freezing, turbulent ocean, while he was allegedly asleep safely below deck. The authorities would launch a massive ocean search, the media would aggressively mourn the tragic loss of the young bride, and the insurance company would swiftly authorize the massive $20 million settlement. The foreign syndicate would receive their untraceable liquid cash, and Harrison Thorne would emerge spotless as a grieving, deeply sympathetic widower, completely innocent of any horrific wrongdoing or crime. Harper begged him frantically, her voice cracking into high, desperate, broken sobs. She promised she would never tell anyone about the hidden server room or the massive blackmail ring. She swore she would sign quiet divorce papers immediately and walk away with absolutely nothing. She pleaded for her young life, offering total silence in exchange for survival. But Harrison simply shushed her, his tone dropping back into that sickeningly gentle, patronizing rhythm. He calmly explained that it was far too late for compromises. The insurance policy was already active, and the ruthless foreign syndicate was breathing down his neck. He needed the massive influx of liquid cash instantly, and she was now the only viable physical asset he had left to liquidate securely. Then he delivered a final, devastating psychological blow. Harper cried out wildly that I would never stop investigating her sudden death, that I would aggressively demand a full police inquiry into the tragic boating accident. Harrison chuckled darkly, completely unbothered by her desperate, empty threat. He told her he had already anticipated my predictable, emotional, fatherly interference. He had instructed his elite programmers to meticulously create a flawless, highly intricate, and totally damning digital paper trail. Over the past 3 weeks, while I was agonizing over her sudden isolation, his hackers had systematically routed $2 million in stolen, laundered cryptocurrency directly into my personal retirement accounts. He had expertly fabricated a massive web of encrypted emails, illegal offshore banking requests, and digital communication logs that perfectly traced back to my home network. If I dared to speak up after her tragic accident, if I went to the federal authorities demanding an investigation into his affairs, Harrison would simply hand the fabricated evidence over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation without a single second of hesitation. He would paint me brilliantly as the shadowy, corrupt mastermind behind the entire multi-million-dollar blackmail ring. He would tell the authorities that he was just an innocent, grieving husband who had tragically discovered his aging father-in-law was running a massive criminal enterprise through his proprietary smart home network. I would be instantly arrested, federally indicted, and completely buried under a mountain of irrefutable, expertly forged digital evidence. I would be locked away in a federal penitentiary long before I could even attend the funeral service for my only beautiful daughter. He had meticulously planned absolutely everything. The heavy audio transmission clicked off abruptly as a heavy wooden door slammed loudly in the master bedroom above the hidden analog microphone. The sudden, overwhelming silence inside the dark, copper-lined surveillance van was absolutely deafening. Thomas stared blankly at the glowing green audio equalizer on his main screen, his hands hovering completely frozen over the custom mechanical keyboard. He slowly turned his head to look at me, the color completely drained from his deeply weathered face. We had just listened to a ruthless billionaire casually schedule the brutal execution of my child and my own total criminal framing. I sat rigidly in the dark passenger seat, my breathing shallow and erratic. The cold, unyielding reality of the horrific situation crushed down aggressively on my chest like a massive, suffocating physical weight. My hands were shaking so violently I had to press them completely flat against the cold metal table to keep them steady. Harrison Thorne had successfully built an inescapable, truly flawless trap. He controlled the physical environment, he masterfully manipulated the entire digital narrative, and he now held complete, terrifying control over my absolute survival. I was just a ghost, caught entirely in his dark, evil web. My only daughter was officially scheduled to be brutally murdered in exactly 48 hours in the middle of a freezing, turbulent ocean. And I was already expertly framed for a massive network of federal crimes. If I went to the police right now, they would immediately see the stolen funds resting securely in my retirement accounts. They would arrest me instantly, confiscating my devices, and Harrison would simply carry out his gruesome maritime execution exactly as planned, while I sat helplessly trapped inside a federal holding cell. Going to the authorities was a guaranteed death sentence for my daughter. I was completely boxed in, staring directly down the dark barrel of an impossible, rapidly ticking clock. Every single logical exit strategy was aggressively blocked by a wall of digital evidence or an army of heavily armed private security contractors. I closed my eyes, trying desperately to force my racing heart to slow its frantic rhythm. The image of Harper's terrified face flashed vividly in my mind. She was completely isolated inside that cold glass fortress, knowing she had only 2 short days left to live, waiting for a father who was currently powerless to break down the heavy doors. Thomas cleared his dry throat, the rough sound breaking the heavy tension filling the van. "Richard," he whispered, his voice incredibly tight with raw fear. "We cannot fight this digitally. His network will flag any defensive maneuvers we attempt, and the federal framing is already firmly in place. If we move against him through traditional legal channels, you will be in handcuffs by midnight, and Harper will be thrown overboard on Friday. We need a completely invisible analog strategy. We need to physically extract her from that estate before they reach the marina, and we must simply vanish completely forever." I opened my eyes, the crushing despair slowly hardening into a cold, terrifying resolve. I was not going to let that monster drown my child, and I was not going to rot in a federal prison for his crimes. Harrison wanted to play a ruthless game of life and death, but he made a critical miscalculation. I had absolutely nothing left to lose. I looked at Thomas, my jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. "We are not just going to extract her, Thomas. We are going to completely dismantle him physically before that yacht ever leaves the harbor dock." Thomas stared at me as if I had suddenly lost my mind. He frantically pointed at the glowing audio equipment, his voice rising in panic, urging me to gather the decrypted offshore ledger and drive straight to the nearest Federal Bureau of Investigation field office. He argued that we had irrefutable proof of a massive criminal conspiracy, extortion, and premeditated murder. But I aggressively shook my head, shutting down his logical, bureaucratic approach instantly. The local authorities were entirely compromised by the vast reach of Harrison and his blackmail operation. Even if the federal agents took my fabricated framing into consideration, the slow, agonizing gears of federal bureaucracy simply would not turn fast enough. Warrants took days to secure. Digital evidence took weeks to properly authenticate in a court of law. The yacht was scheduled to sail into deep international waters in exactly 48 hours. If we spooked him now, if a single federal agent knocked on that heavy steel gate, Harrison would immediately execute his contingency plan. He would murder my daughter, instantly wipe the servers completely clean, and disappear into the wind with his billions of untraceable offshore cash. We could not afford a single procedural delay. I paced the narrow floor of the copper-lined surveillance van, my mind reverting back to the foundational principles of structural engineering. When you need to safely and completely demolish a massive towering concrete skyscraper, you do not foolishly push your heavy machinery against the thickest, most heavily reinforced exterior wall. You completely ignore the imposing, heavily armored facade. Instead, you meticulously analyze the hidden skeleton of the building to find the primary structural load point. You locate the single highly stressed pillar that carries the absolute maximum weight of the entire structure. If you strategically shatter that specific pillar, the immense crushing weight of the building itself will do the rest of the destructive work for you. Harrison Thorne had built a flawless digital fortress, but his massive inflated ego was his ultimate load-bearing pillar. His absolute arrogance, his deep-seated belief that everyone else was fundamentally inferior and entirely predictable, was the singular fragile point where his entire empire was highly vulnerable to a catastrophic total collapse. I just needed to use his own overwhelming vanity directly against him. I needed him to actively invite the demolition crew right through his heavily guarded front door. I sat down at the heavy steel desk reaching for my cellular phone. I closed my eyes, forcing the hot, blinding rage deeply down into my stomach, locking it away securely. I had to deliver the absolute performance of my entire life. I had to become the exact pathetic, broken, and completely clueless old man that Harrison so thoroughly believed me to be. I dialed his direct personal number, my thumb trembling slightly as the phone began to ring. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice smooth, confident, and dripping with that same manufactured artificial warmth. "Richard, what a completely unexpected surprise to hear from you so soon after your unannounced visit." I took a deep, shuddering breath, deliberately injecting a pathetic, wet quaver into my aging voice. "Harrison," I began, letting a soft, authentic-sounding sob break through my words. "I am calling to sincerely apologize. I was sitting here alone in my empty house, and I just realized how foolish and intrusive I have been. I am just a lonely old man who misses his little girl. But my behavior today was completely out of line. I was disrespectful to your household, and I deeply regret it." The silence on the line stretched for a long, agonizing moment. I could practically hear the arrogant satisfaction swelling inside his dark, twisted mind. He loved hearing me beg. He loved the absolute submission. "Well," Richard Harrison finally replied, his tone heavy with sickening magnanimity, "I appreciate your apology. Marriage is a delicate transition, and we simply need our private space to establish our new life together." I pressed forward, pouring every ounce of pathetic desperation I could muster into the phone. "I know, Harrison. I know you are a brilliant, busy man, and you provide a wonderful life for my daughter. I just want to make things right between us. I want to build a real bond with my new son-in-law. I heard Harper mention you were taking the private yacht out this coming Friday for a weekend cruise. Please, Harrison, let me come along. Just for the weekend. I promise I will stay out of your way. I just want to see my daughter smile, and I want to genuinely toast to your new marriage. I am begging you to give this foolish old man a second chance to be a supportive part of your family." I held the phone tightly against my ear, listening to the quiet, rhythmic breathing of a cold-blooded killer, calculating his next tactical move. I knew exactly what was running through his arrogant, highly analytical mind. He was weighing the statistical variables. On one hand, having me on the boat was a minor physical inconvenience. On the other hand, my sudden tragic death alongside his beautiful bride would completely eliminate the only remaining loose end in his elaborate, deeply criminal framing operation. To an arrogant psychopath like Harrison Thorne, the dramatic narrative was simply too perfect to resist. He would gleefully stage a horrific, devastating maritime accident. An aging, desperate father tragically drowning while foolishly attempting to save his beloved daughter from a sudden storm in the dark ocean. It would completely solidify his public image as the devastated solitary survivor of a massive, unthinkable family tragedy. The media would absolutely consume the story, and the insurance payout would clear perfectly without a single question asked. He figured a lonely old man was completely entirely under his thumb, just another easily manipulated pawn in his grand evil design. Richard Harrison said softly, his voice echoing with a dark, terrifying amusement that chilled me to the absolute bone. "I think that is a truly wonderful idea. We would absolutely love to have you join us on the water this Friday. We will leave all this silly tension behind us and finally become a real united family." I thanked him profusely, my voice shaking with fabricated gratitude, and ended the call. I lowered the phone, staring into the dark, quiet space of the surveillance van. The deadly invitation was officially secured. The trap was permanently set. Thomas looked at me, a grim, silent acknowledgement passing between us. He knew the terrifying magnitude of the impossible task I had just actively initiated. I had just voluntarily placed my own physical body directly inside the lethal crosshairs of a ruthless, highly resourced sociopath. But I was absolutely not going to walk onto that massive, luxurious death trap completely unprepared. I turned to my trusted ally, my mind rapidly assembling the intricate mechanical details of my counteroffensive. Listen closely. Thomas, I need you to completely dismantle the tracking algorithms on my personal vehicle. I instructed, my voice incredibly cold and steady. We officially have less than 48 hours to prepare the hardware for this complex maritime extraction. The next 48 hours blurred into a frantic marathon of clandestine preparations. Thomas utilized his underground network of former federal contacts to procure exactly what I needed, without triggering a single alarm on Harrison's surveillance grid. I did not pack a suitcase with resort wear. Instead, I assembled a highly specialized tactical loadout, disguised perfectly within the fragile trappings of a declining senior citizen. By Friday afternoon, the heavy air was thick with the metallic taste of an approaching storm. Dark clouds were actively gathering on the western horizon, setting the stage for the tragic disaster Harrison had orchestrated. I arrived at the exclusive private marina just as the first cold drops of rain began to fall. Harrison, magnificent luxury motor yacht, was moored at the end of the primary pier, a towering monument to wealth. I stepped slowly out of my vehicle, leaning dramatically onto a sturdy aluminum walking cane. Strapped securely across my right shoulder was a bulky medical oxygen tank connected to a clear plastic nasal cannula. I forced my breathing to sound shallow and labored, projecting the pathetic image of a broken father clinging to the twilight of his life. Harrison stood proudly at the top of the polished teak boarding ramp, flanked by the same two armed private security contractors. He was dressed impeccably in expensive nautical wear, holding a glass of champagne. When he saw me shuffling up the wooden dock, dragging the heavy medical oxygen tank, a smug smile spread across his handsome face. In his predatory mind, I was walking blindly right into his elaborate execution chamber. Richard Harrison called out smoothly, raising his champagne glass in a mock toast as I struggled up the steep ramp. "You made it. I see you brought some extra medical luggage with you. I hope the sea air does not prove too strenuous for your delicate respiratory system." I paused at the top of the ramp, panting heavily, offering him a weak smile. My doctor insisted I bring the supplemental oxygen, just as a strict precaution. Harrison. I wheezed, my voice trembling with perfectly manufactured vulnerability. My lungs have not been the same lately, but I could not miss this incredible opportunity to bond with my wonderful new family. Harrison chuckled darkly, stepping aside to let me pass. "Of course, Richard. We are going to have an unforgettable weekend together." I stepped onto the immaculate deck of the massive vessel. Harper was sitting quietly on a white leather sofa near the stern, completely swathed in a designer trench coat, despite the warm air. She looked pale, her beautiful eyes utterly devoid of hope. When she saw me dragging the oxygen tank, a flash of pure, agonizing despair crossed her face. She thought I had foolishly surrendered. She thought I was just as trapped as she was. I gave her a comforting nod, but she looked away, staring blankly out at the churning water. The heavy diesel engines roared to life beneath our feet, vibrating through the solid deck. The highly trained civilian crew expertly cast off the mooring lines, and the yacht began to glide smoothly out of the sheltered marina, heading directly toward the vast expanse of the open ocean. For the first 2 hours, Harrison played the role of the gracious host with absolute perfection. He offered me expensive drinks, pointed out the luxurious amenities of his floating palace, and spoke eloquently about his ambitious plans for his corporate empire. But as the towering skyscrapers of the city skyline shrank into indistinct gray blurs on the distant horizon, The atmosphere aboard the vessel began to drastically shift. The dark storm clouds had swallowed the afternoon sun, plunging the ocean into an ominous twilight. The wind was picking up, aggressively whipping the dark waves into high swells that rocked the yacht with increasing force. We had officially crossed the invisible maritime boundary. We were now operating in international waters entirely outside the immediate jurisdiction of the coastal authorities. This was the exact lawless environment Harrison required to execute his brutal plan without legal interference. Harrison stood up from his lounging chair, stretching his arms casually above his head. He pressed a small button on his digital wristwatch. Immediately, the captain voice echoed through the overhead speakers, announcing that the primary crew was retiring to the lower decks to wait out the squall. Within seconds, the deckhands vanished, sealing the watertight doors behind them. We were completely alone on the spacious upper deck. Just Harrison, his two security contractors, my terrified daughter, and a helpless old man tethered to an oxygen tank. The polite charade dropped instantly. The welcoming smile completely melted off Harrison's face, replaced by a mask of pure, unrestrained sadism. He reached smoothly behind his back, pulling a black semi-automatic handgun from his waistband. The weapon was equipped with a heavy metallic suppressor. He held it casually, the dark barrel pointing loosely toward the wooden deck. The two security guards stepped forward simultaneously, fanning out to block the port and starboard exits. Their hands rested firmly on their holstered weapons, their eyes scanning the churning ocean to ensure there were absolutely no witnesses for miles. Harper let out a terrified scream, instinctively curling her body tightly into the corner of the white leather sofa. I dropped my walking cane. It clattered onto the polished teak deck. I let out a loud gasp, clutching my chest as if the shock was triggering a massive cardiac event. Harrison laughed. It was a joyless sound that cut right through the howling wind. "Look at you, Richard," he sneered, closing the distance between us. "You are completely pathetic. I thought a man who built skyscrapers might possess at least a fraction of intelligence. But you are just a sentimental, foolish old man. You walked up my boarding ramp and begged me to bring you out to your watery grave. I did not even have to force you. You practically carried your own tombstone onto my boat." "Please, Harrison," I stammered, backing away slowly, forcing my hands to shake wildly. "I just wanted to see my daughter. Whatever she has done, please let her go. I will give you whatever you want." Harrison shook his head, his eyes burning with absolute arrogance. "I already have what I want, Richard. I have a $20 million insurance policy and a perfect digital paper trail proving you are the criminal mastermind behind my blackmail operation. When the Coast Guard recovers your drowned bodies from this storm, my problems will be permanently solved." He turned toward the sofa, grabbing Harper by the lapels of her heavy trench coat. He hoisted her to her feet, dragging her across the slippery deck toward the stainless steel railing bordering the violent ocean. The waves crashed heavily against the hull, sending freezing salt water spraying across our faces. Harper struggled weakly, sobbing in terror, but his grip was unrelenting. He pressed her against the metal railing, forcing her to look down into the churning abyss below. Harrison raised the suppressed handgun, leveling the barrel directly at the center of my chest. His finger rested lightly on the metal trigger. He smiled, savoring his moment of absolute control. "You should have stayed in your lane, old man." I did not flinch. I did not beg. I simply stood my ground on the slippery teak deck, feeling the freezing ocean spray lash against my face. Harrison smiled, his finger tightening incrementally on the metal trigger, anticipating my final, pathetic plea for mercy. Harper squeezed her eyes shut, sobbing into her hands, completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of the moment. I slowly lowered my hands from my chest, my posture shifting from that of a terrified, frail senior citizen to the rigid, grounded stance of a man who had spent 4 decades wrestling with industrial steel and heavy concrete. I casually raised my left wrist, pulling back the damp sleeve of my stolen uniform jacket. I looked down at the glowing dial of my wristwatch, watching the second hand tick forward with absolute precision. "You honestly believe I am just a foolish old man, Harrison," I said. My voice completely stripped of the pathetic, trembling weakness I had meticulously manufactured all day. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that easily cut through the howling wind. "You actually think I brought medical oxygen on board your vessel?" The arrogant smirk on his handsome face faltered for a fraction of a second. The two armed security contractors shifted uneasily, exchanging a quick, confused glance through the violent rain. Harrison narrowed his dark eyes, gripping the handgun tighter. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, the smooth confidence in his voice cracking just slightly. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, ignoring the weapon pointed squarely at my heart. "You see, Harrison, you spent your entire life mastering invisible data. You built an empire by manipulating wireless signals and digital algorithms. But you fundamentally failed to respect the absolute, undeniable reality of physical mechanics. When I first boarded your magnificent floating palace this afternoon, I put on quite a show. I dramatically stumbled near the primary lower deck access hatch. I wheezed, I coughed, and I leaned heavily against the brass railing right above your primary ventilation shafts. But I was not struggling to breathe. I was covertly feeding a highly pressurized, transparent rubber hose directly down into the primary saltwater cooling intake manifold of your massive diesel engines. And this heavy steel cylinder strapped to my aching back does not contain compressed medical oxygen. It is completely filled to the brim with a highly concentrated, delayed reaction, industrial-grade corrosive acid. I specifically formulated the chemical compound myself in my garage. It takes exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes for the acid to completely eat through the reinforced steel housing of an active high-temperature engine block. I looked back down at the ticking watch on my wrist, a cold, ruthless smile spreading across my face. And our time is officially up. Before Harrison could even process the words I had just spoken, a massive, catastrophic explosion violently rocked the entire vessel. The heavy teak deck violently lurched beneath our boots, throwing the two armed security guards completely off balance. A deafening metallic screech erupted from the lower engine room, followed instantly by the terrifying sound of heavy machinery forcefully tearing itself apart. Thick, suffocating plumes of toxic black smoke immediately billowed out from the lower ventilation grates, choking the turbulent ocean air. The corrosive acid had perfectly breached the highly pressurized cooling systems, causing the twin diesel engines to violently overheat and detonate within their confined steel chambers. The sophisticated electrical grid of the multi-million-dollar yacht fried instantly. The glowing navigation panels, the digital communication arrays, and the localized wireless security network immediately went completely dark. We were plunged into the chaotic gray twilight of the storm, entirely stripped of power. The vessel groaned heavily as a secondary internal explosion breached the lower hull. I knew the incredibly harsh reality of maritime physics. The boat was actively taking on thousands of gallons of freezing seawater, and it was quickly losing buoyancy. The two security contractors panicked, completely abandoning their tactical positions. They dropped their heavy weapons, scrambling frantically toward the life raft deployment stations at the stern, their loyalty to Harrison instantly evaporating in the face of imminent catastrophic drowning. Harrison stumbled backward against the metal railing, coughing violently, as the thick, black smoke rapidly engulfed the upper deck. He stared in absolute horror at the billowing clouds rising from the belly of his sinking fortress. While he was completely distracted by the catastrophic failure of his vessel, I firmly pressed my right heel down onto the solid wooden deck. I shifted my entire body weight onto my back foot, hearing the distinct, satisfying crunch of the hidden mechanical switch embedded deeply within the thick rubber sole of my work boot. That simple physical action instantly activated a high-frequency analog SOS transmitter that Thomas had meticulously wired into the lining of my jacket. The device immediately fired an unstoppable, continuous analog pulse directly up to a secure military satellite relay orbiting high above the storm clouds. The powerful transmission bypassed the fried digital systems of the yacht entirely. Within seconds, Thomas was actively broadcasting our exact geographical coordinates, alongside the fully decrypted, highly incriminating audio files of Harrison's blackmail confessions, directly to the federal authorities. The realization of his total destruction finally registered in Harrison's dark eyes. His massive criminal empire, his pristine public image, and his luxurious escape vehicle were all completely burning down around him in the middle of a violent ocean storm. He let out a primal, enraged scream, raising the suppressed handgun once again. He lunged forward through the smoke, aiming the weapon directly at my chest, determined to execute his revenge before the vessel sank. I did not retreat. I swiftly unbuckled the heavy canvas strap, securing the thick steel cylinder to my shoulder. As Harrison charged his finger, pulling the trigger, I swung the dense 50-pound metal tank with brutal, unrestrained force. I used it as a massive battering ram, smashing the solid steel base directly into his left knee. The horrifying crack of shattering bone echoed over the howling wind. Harrison collapsed onto the slippery deck, screaming in absolute agony, the handgun spinning away into the dark, churning water. I dropped the heavy metal cylinder, grabbed Harper tightly by the arm, and aggressively pulled her behind the solid protection of a reinforced steel bulkhead as the yacht violently tilted toward the dark, freezing waves. She was completely paralyzed by the chaotic, terrifying violence unfolding so rapidly around us. The freezing rain lashed down upon the sinking vessel, washing the thick black smoke across the heavily slanted deck. Harrison writhed pitifully on the ground, clutching his shattered leg as the cold seawater began washing over the lower rails. I held my beautiful daughter incredibly close to my pounding chest, shielding her entirely from the howling, relentless storm. I knew the federal agents were already dispatching rescue helicopters toward our exact coordinates. His invisible multi-million-dollar empire was completely dead, and my long, agonizing war to finally bring my child back home was officially over. We just had to wait for the arrival of the inevitable, heavily armed federal cavalry to pull us from the dark, freezing water. We crouched behind the cold steel bulkhead as the freezing ocean water rapidly surrounded our boots. The crippled vessel groaned under the immense pressure of the violent storm. Harper buried her face against my shoulder, trembling uncontrollably, while thick black smoke continued pouring from the ruined lower decks. Harrison was still screaming in the distance, his pathetic cries of pain completely swallowed by the deafening roar of the wind. Then I heard it. A deep rhythmic thumping sound cut through the heavy tempest. It was not the mechanical failure of the dying yacht. It was heavy military-grade rotor blades. Through the dark, swirling smoke and driving rain, massive floodlights pierced the darkness, illuminating the slanted teak deck with blinding white beams. 2 United States Coast Guard helicopters hovered steadily directly above our sinking vessel. The turbulent downdraft from the massive rotors whipped the ocean spray into a violent frenzy. Before Harrison or his terrified security contractors could even comprehend what was happening, thick black ropes dropped rapidly from the hovering aircraft. Heavily armed federal tactical agents fast-roped onto the slick wooden deck with absolute terrifying precision. They moved with flawless tactical efficiency, their heavy assault rifles raised high. They swarmed the upper deck in a matter of seconds. The 2 private security contractors instantly dropped to their knees, throwing their empty hands high into the air, completely surrendering without firing a single defensive shot. 2 federal agents moved swiftly toward Harrison, pinning him firmly against the wet wooden floorboards. He thrashed wildly, screaming arrogant threats and demanding his expensive corporate lawyers, but his desperate protests were entirely useless. The cold steel handcuffs snapped forcefully around his wrists, locking him permanently into his new reality. I held Harper tightly as a tactical medical responder rushed over to assess us. I looked past the medic, locking my eyes directly onto Harrison as the federal agents dragged him roughly toward the rescue basket. His pristine, customized nautical clothing was completely ruined, stained heavily with dark engine grease and his own blood. His handsome face was contorted into a mask of pure, unrestrained rage and utter disbelief. He stared back at me, his arrogant mind clearly fracturing, as he tried to comprehend the absolute totality of his defeat. He simply could not fathom how his flawless, multi-million-dollar digital empire had just been completely dismantled by an old and tired engineer. He possessed an army of brilliant programmers, cutting-edge biometric security protocols, and billions of dollars in untraceable offshore accounts. He thought that advanced technology made him completely untouchable. But his invisible fortress was absolutely obliterated by a 70-year-old structural engineer wielding a homemade canister of corrosive industrial acid and a primitive high-frequency analog radio wave. Physical reality had violently, forcefully reasserted itself over his artificial digital domain. We were safely hoisted up into the warm, secure cabin of the rescue helicopter, leaving Harrison Thorne and his sinking, smoking death trap behind in the cold, dark ocean. 6 months later, the chilling reality of his massive criminal enterprise became the absolute focal point of global news media. The relentless evening broadcasts played a continuous, staggering montage of his spectacular downfall. Harrison Thorne, the celebrated billionaire tech visionary, was completely stripped of his pristine public armor. He sat inside a sterile federal courtroom, wearing a shapeless orange prison uniform, looking incredibly small and entirely ordinary. He was formally facing multiple consecutive life sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the absolute possibility of parole. The mountain of irrefutable digital evidence against him was completely, entirely, truly staggering. The federal authorities had successfully recovered the encrypted digital ledgers, exposing a massive, deeply sinister cyber extortion syndicate that spanned the entire globe. He was formally indicted for countless federal charges of systemic wire fraud, international blackmail, and the premeditated attempted murder of my daughter. Thomas had proven to be the ultimate invisible guardian angel. The brilliant analog data transmission he successfully relayed to the military satellite had completely cleared my name before the authorities even processed the massive digital frame-up Harrison had meticulously designed. The expert decryption of the hidden offshore financial ledgers destroyed Harrison completely and entirely. This crucial evidence allowed the federal government to immediately freeze and seize every single corrupted asset Harrison possessed. His $12 million fortress was seized, his offshore accounts were permanently frozen, and the corrupt politicians he had actively blackmailed were completely exposed to the harsh light of public justice. The monster was finally locked away inside a concrete cell that no amount of digital hacking could ever open. The gentle, warm breeze of the early autumn afternoon rustled quietly through the ancient pine trees surrounding my modest, quiet property. I sat peacefully on the solid, sturdy wooden bench resting outside. Holding a steaming mug of fresh coffee, I looked at Harper sitting closely beside me. A soft, incredibly thick knitted blanket wrapped warmly around her shoulders. She was completely safe. The horrible dark purple bruises that had once marred her beautiful face were entirely gone, replaced by the slow, returning glow of genuine health and profound peace. She was actively attending specialized trauma therapy every single week, courageously doing the incredibly difficult emotional work required to slowly heal her deeply wounded spirit. It was a long, challenging journey, but the terrified, broken hostage I had rescued was completely gone forever. In her place was a profoundly strong, incredibly resilient young woman who was finally reclaiming her stolen life. She rested her head gently against my shoulder, letting out a long, contented sigh as we watched a small family of deer graze peacefully at the distant edge of the forest. The overwhelming darkness that had completely suffocated our family was permanently banished. I looked out over the quiet, peaceful landscape, feeling a profound sense of absolute closure settling deeply within my aging bones. I did not possess billions of dollars, an elite private army of armed contractors, or sophisticated digital spyware. I was just an aging man with stiff joints and calloused hands. But I possessed something incredibly powerful that Harrison Thorne could never possibly comprehend. I possessed the unyielding, absolute structural integrity of a father defending his child. The heavy love of a parent is an unbreakable foundation that can easily withstand the most violent storms. We had survived the nightmare, the physical world, the heavy, undeniable weight of concrete steel, and genuine human connection had absolutely crushed his artificial digital illusions. I took a deep, calming breath of the crisp autumn air and feeling truly alive for the first time. Never ignore the quiet, subtle signs of a collapsing foundation. When the people you love suddenly change, pay close attention to the structural shifts hiding just beneath the surface. Look for the invisible fractures and the heavy burdens they are carrying entirely alone. Protect your family with the unyielding strength of solid steel and deeply reinforced concrete. Do not let artificial barriers block you from discovering the genuine truth. And most importantly, as you navigate this beautiful, complicated world, please remember my final warning. Never ever underestimate a determined old man who has absolutely nothing left to lose in life.